Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call to order the Striped Bass Board. I'm Mike Armstrong from Massachusetts, your chair. We have lots to do today. I would encourage everyone to be succinct, non-redundant, and I think we can do a lot of good things today. Every board so far has ended early. I think that should be our goal. With that, if you can get a second. So everyone has an agenda. Are there any changes, amendments, additions? Seeing none, I see approval by consent. You have seen the proceedings from the February meeting. Any changes? Then we will be approved by consent. At this point, we have a few people signed up for public comment. With the reminder, public comment should be brief and aimed at things that are not on the agenda today. There may be opportunity to speak to motions, etc., later on, so please keep your comments to things concerning striped bass that are not on the agenda. Monica Scheneman.
Good morning, everyone. Good job on pronouncing my name, by the way. Yes, I'm Monica Scheneman, and I'm the president of the Potomac River Working Watermen's Association. We're a group of Virginia and Maryland watermen and women who work on the Potomac. We also have members who do not necessarily work on the water, but they appreciate what we do, providing seafood to the public. I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank each of you for working to the best of your abilities to manage our fisheries for future generations. May God grant you the wisdom you need today to make some difficult decisions regarding some gap variances. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Mike Lightfoot.
Thank you very much for listening to us. I'm Mike Lightfoot, as you said. I'm a commercial waterman in Virginia and with Potomac Striped Bass Quota. I also represent our Twin Rivers Watermen's Association, and I'm a member of the Virginia Watermen's Association. We appreciate the focus on different options on reducing the mortality and reducing the overfishing. And we also appreciate the focus on the recreational side, which catches a big portion of the fish, and the recognition that the commercial sector is just a small portion, 10% or less coastwide, of what's caught. So we appreciate all of your efforts, and we look forward to some good results. Thank you.
Thank you. Robert Brown.
Robert T. Brown, President of the Maryland Watermen's Association. I'd like to thank you all for listening to me today, and hope we have a good deliberation here today. I just want to talk to you just a minute or so just about our tagging system that we use in the Chesapeake Bay and the Maryland portion of it. On our rockfish, we have issued a certain amount of tags every year according to our quota. Each fisherman gets his individual tags, which are numbered with the state on it, so they can be tracked wherever they may go. What other state you may ship fish into, they can be traced back to the person who catches them. Also, besides that, when we get these tags, once we catch a fish, we have to tag it immediately. Once we tag them, we have to take them into a check-in station. They are counted, and the weight is taken on them to make sure that we are very accurate on what we do. At the end of the season, if we haven't used up all our tags, we have to return those tags in as we are accountable for them. I'm just reminding you all of this to show you how our regulations are very tight on the commercial men in the state of Maryland, and it's like that pretty much up and down the bay with a few different pieces into it. And I'd like to thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for your comments. That's all the folks we have signed up. Moving along, we're going to an action item, ultimately to consider acceptance of the striped bass benchmark stock assessment. The first presentation will be by Mike, an overview of the assessment.
Okay, thank you. So I have a very short presentation, just a recap of the presentation I gave in February to largely set the stage for Dr. Latour's presentation. So we'll start this presentation the way we like to start all of these presentations, with a huge thank you to the entire assessment team, the technical committee, the stock assessment subcommittee, the tagging subcommittee. It won't be possible to thank all these people enough for all the work that they did to get us through the assessment. So in February, I talked about the bridge building process and so forth that we had gone through. We started with the 2013 SOL 57 stock assessment model and updated that with calibrated MRIP data and made a variety of other changes that are displayed on the slide. Just really quickly, of course, bringing in the calibrated MRIP data was one of the larger data changes that we had made. We extended the plus group from age 13 to 15. We removed the commercial dead release fleet, and were able to partition those or apportion those fish into their respective Chesapeake and coastal fleets. We developed a revised methodology for estimating commercial dead discards. We made a number of index changes. We removed several indices, the the Northeast Fisheries Science Center trawl, the Virginia Pound Net Index. We brought in some new indices, CHESMAP trawl index, Delaware 30-foot trawl index. We were able to incorporate some age composition information into what were formerly age aggregate indices. So as an example, the MRIP index, catch per angler, we have age composition information associated with that survey, or that index. And the Connecticut trawl index, we're also able to bring in some age composition information. We also are able to develop a single unified young of year index for the Chesapeake Bay, incorporating the Maryland and Virginia young of year indices. We updated the female maturity ogive, and the terminal year of the model was 2017. So the Stock Assessment Subcommittee and Gary Nelson in particular put a great deal of effort into a two-stock migration model. In this model, involved two stocks, the Chesapeake stock, in which fish could move from the Chesapeake into the ocean region, and it jointly modeled the Hudson River Delaware River stocks. The Hudson River Delaware River stocks. They would mix in a common ocean region. The peer review panel didn't think that model was quite ready to provide management advice, and I suspect Dr. Latour's presentation will go into some of their deliberations and reasons for that. So we are using the same model that was reviewed in 2013 to provide management advice. That statistical catch-at-age model incorporates the changes that I outlined in the first or second slide. The catch-at-age model provides information on recruitment, fishing mortality, selectivity, catchability, provides abundance at age, female spawning stock, and I'll show some of those results now. First, a recap on our reference points. We maintained for this assessment the same definitions that had been used previously. Our threshold definition is female spawning stock biomass as estimated in the model from 1995. The fishing mortality reference point is the fishing mortality that gets us to that SSB level over the long term. The target is defined as 125% of the threshold, and there's an analogous F reference point that gets us there over the long term. In terms of actual point values, on the left we have the addendum 4 reference point values. Female spawning stock biomass was estimated in 1995 was estimated at just under 58,000 metric tons. After incorporation of the calibrated MRIP data and a variety of other changes that we've incorporated into the model, the new estimate is quite a bit higher. It's just over 91,000 metric tons. And as I described earlier, the associated F reference points are the fishing mortalities that get us to those SSB levels over the long term. The next slide shows model estimates of recruitment. The horizontal line shows the time series average recruitment. We've highlighted in blue several strong year classes in recent years. And the plot does show the y-axis is in millions of age 1 fish. The plot shows a period of very low recruitment from the early 80s through the mid-90s, a period of higher recruitment from the mid-90s through the early 2000s, then a period of low but variable recruitment since the early 2000s, and it does illustrate several strong year classes. The 2011, 2014, and 2015 year classes are fairly strong year classes. The next plot is the time series of fishing mortality. The horizontal line shows the threshold level. That fishing at that level over the long term should get us to the 1995 level of SSB. And you can see from the plot the terminal year 2017 fishing mortality is above the threshold. The next plot is female spawning stock biomass. Horizontal line shows, again, the threshold. That, by definition, is our 1995 level of SSB. The terminal estimate, 2017's estimate, is below the threshold. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Any questions? And I have one, Mike. We saw this previous. It was termed preliminary, but in fact, this is now official, and there's no changes since what you gave last time, correct?
Correct.
Okay, just making sure. Rob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just wondering the impact of the recalibrated MRIP. So, for example, I know with summer flounder, the comments were that it definitely scaled up the spawning stock biomass. Do we get the same impression here? I think that the idea was that there was overall an average of maybe 260% difference as the average over the older MRIP. But I guess more important is, what did the revised MRIP do to the spawning stock? How did that figure in?
Yes. Thank you for that question. Yeah, we did see a scaling up of abundance quite a bit. In our bridge building process to sort of help us diagnose the impact of incremental data changes, including the new calibrated MRIP data, that change alone scaled up abundance and female spawning stock biomass by quite a bit. And it made sense intuitively to us. If we were catching more fish than we were initially aware of, there had to be more fish in the population. So we did see an increase in abundance and spawning stock as a result of the calibrated MRIP data.
Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mike, for your presentation. Mike, during your presentation, you said that the model provided partial Fs for each fleet, and that the model was based on 2 fleets. Is that correct?
Yes.
So what were the 2 fleets that were modeled, and do you have the partial Fs related to those 2? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Yes, the 2 fleets were the Chesapeake fleet, and that incorporates commercial and recreational fisheries combined, and their associated dead releases, and the coastal fleet, everything except for Chesapeake Bay, also incorporates commercial and recreational catches. In this presentation, I don't have the partial Fs. I think we can probably pull that up for you if you'd like to see it. I don't have that in this presentation, but we can probably get that for you.
Ray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike, going back to that slide, you showed us the MREP reports on recreational fishing and commercial landings, and you do the tag with commercial landing, so many tags are sent out, so many come back. How is bycatch mortality considered in the commercial industry beyond the tagging program? Vessels that, different gear types that catch striped bass and discard them dead. How is that accounted for? Thank you.
Thank you for that. We have gear-specific discard mortality rates. I don't have. I can get those for you. It ranges from very low for things like pound net to very high to things like state gill nets. So we look at the proportion of tag returns proportionally across those different gear types and apply those gear-specific mortalities to the ratio of dead discards based on those tag returns.
Follow-up? So once again, we're talking about tag returns. I'm talking about gear types, not tag returns, not vessels that are permitted to land, commercial vessels that are permitted, you know, that have tags. I'm talking about gear types that might interact with striped bass. How is that accounted for? They're discards, they're dead discards. How is that accounted for in the stock assessment?
We are assuming that, at least as best I can recall, we are assuming that those are proportional to the tag return. So even if we're assuming that what we see in those fisheries based on our tag returns is proportional across all of the fisheries. It's just an assumption we have to sort of make. Oh, and Dr. Chu would like to add to that.
So, and we do assume sort of a non-reporting rate for those tags based on other studies that we've done to figure out what's the rate of reporting from those different fisheries that indicate, you know, how many people are actually reporting those tags to us, and then we scale up by kind of an estimate of how many people are not reporting those tags to us. But I think also, so the other thing that we looked at for this assessment is we did look at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center Observer Program data. So we did go through and look at what are the estimates of commercial discards coming from vessels that actually carry observers on them. And the estimates were very similar in terms of trend and generally in terms of magnitude, but they were lower than what we were estimating with our tag-based methods. And that's partly because the Observer Center, the Observer Program really only has good sampling data for the gill nets and for the otter trawls. And we know a lot of the fisheries that direct on striped bass are things like pound nets that aren't well covered by the Observer Program, as well as hook and line fisheries. So the fact that we had similar numbers coming out of the Observer Program, where, you know, we don't have to rely on the tag-based method, and is similar to our tag-based method, gave us more confidence in the results that we are seeing from the tag-based method.
One more follow-up.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Mike. Once again, though, we know about the lack of observer coverage in the commercial fleet over the years. So, but thank you very much.
I have John McMurray, and then John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mike, I noticed we took out the Northeast Trawl Survey from the assessment process. What was the reason for that?
We felt it had very low proportion of positive tows.
So that trawl survey generally takes place offshore outside of 3 nautical miles, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks again for the amazing work on this assessment. I got kind of a follow-up about the discard question. The target fishing mortality from this assessment and the previous one are both seem very low for a species with a life history of the striped bass. Was there any thinking that there could be sources of mortality that are not being picked up, that, for example, discard mortality could be higher than we're estimating?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, our discard mortality rates are estimates across whether it's in the commercial sector by gear or in the recreational fishery across the entire fishery, is an average. So in some cases we know it's going to be a little lower, and in some cases we know it's going to be a little higher, given angling behavior or water temperature, salinity, those kinds of things. So it's perfectly conceivable that, yeah, it's going to be higher or lower in certain circumstances. Our best estimate is sort of a global average.
Any more questions for Mike? Emerson.
If nobody else has a question, I'll come back around, if it's okay, Mr. Chairman. Relative to my question before about partial Fs, and I understand your response, but we know what the removals are by the recreational fishery and the commercial fishery. Is there any output? Did the model provide any information about what F is for the recreational fishing industry overall and the commercial fishing industry overall, including discards?
Because of the way the fleets are constructed, they combine commercial and recreational fleets. We don't have independent estimates of that. One of the suggestions that review panels in the past, not necessarily this review panel, but from the 2013 panel, they did make that suggestion of sort of breaking fleets out by sector, but we haven't done that for this this implementation.
We're able to get the partial F figure if you want.
Oh. But to your earlier question, thank you, we do have the partial Fs. So in general, you can see that the Chesapeake F is generally lower. Coastal Fleet is higher. They showed similar trends, high in the early part of the time series, a low through the mid to late 80s, and then a generally increasing, excuse me, a generally increasing trend from early to mid 90s through the present.
Thank you, Mike. Right now, I'd like to hand off to Rob Latour to give the peer review report.
Can she see me? Can you see? Good morning. It's been a while since I've been before the board of any of the species, so some familiar faces. It's good to see some new. Welcome. I guess I have the envious job this morning of being the messenger about the peer review. In general, I would say it was a very positive and constructive peer review. As you know, striped bass were on the calendar for benchmark assessment in 2018. The benchmark assessment was put together by the Stock Assessment Subcommittee, the Tagging Subcommittee, and the Technical Committee as a whole. They did the heavy lifting for many months, and then the external peer review consisted of a chair and 3 members of the Center of Independent Experts. The emphasis of the review was strictly on the science, and the fundamental charge we were given involved whether or not the modeling and the results could be used to form the basis for management advice. And we are, or were, implored to recommend an acceptance or a non-acceptance to elements of the model put forth. Background material can be found on the Northeast Fisheries Science Center's website for the SOSLARC process. You'll find the summary report that I authored of the review, and then the independent peer review summary reports, as well as all the associated assessment documentation and supporting material therein. So my role as chair came about, for those of you who don't know me, I'm a professor at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. I'm also a member of the Mid-Atlantic SSC. The companion species for this review that took place last November was summer flounder, which is jointly managed, of course, here in the Mid-Atlantic Council, but we generally have a SSC member chair the review for the council who's has a vested interest in those species. So my role came to be as chair largely because of that position. The panelists were from the CIE, Dr. Robin Cook, who actually was a reviewer for the striped bass assessment the last time it went through reviews, so it was nice to have some continuation there. John Casey from CFIS, retired as a consultant now, and Yan Zhao from Virginia Tech, also an SSC member of the Mid-Atlantic. And we met last November in nice warm Woods Hole. So I'll spend a few moments here in the beginning kind of outlining the focus of the discussions and deliberations regarding the material put forth by the Stock Assessment Subcommittee. I'm sure, as you know, there was a huge effort put forth by the team to develop a very innovative, in my opinion, one-of-a-kind stock assessment model that took into consideration stock structure explicitly. It broke the annual time step into periods, so there was a seasonal element to it. It considered things spatially as well, 2 regions, the coastal ocean versus the bay. in the catch at age modeling framework, herein noted as the 2 SCA model, the 2 stock model. And to be fair and honest, most of our discussion with the team was revolving around this model. It was really intriguing, very innovative. I would say the group as a whole was very supportive. But as many new innovative models come online, there's lots of questions, there's lots of research interests, there's lots of academic concerns when a model comes into its infancy like that. And there was just too much uncertainties for the panel to suggest it should be accepted for management advice. But that being said, I'll go over here in a little bit. Lots of discussion, lots of guidance that we gave for the group to move forward. I'll highlight 2 things. Simultaneous with this massively new structure, the stock assessment subcommittee also attempted to redefine the reference points to be stock specific. For the SSB, the spawning stock biomass reference points, there was a Delaware SSB reference point and a Chesapeake Bay reference point. And 3 fishing mortality reference points, 2 for the Bay stock, 1 for Delaware. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a second. When partway through the meeting, when it was clear the panel was not going to accept the 2 stock model, as Mike has described, the team brought forward a revised version of the traditional statistical catch at age model, the same model in principle that was used for SARC 57, the most recent peer review. They did incorporate some new structural modifications and some advancements based on that SARC 57 peer review, which I think provide you with some of the same management options or opportunities as the 2 stock model might have gained. So we were able to view that in a little bit more contracted period. Part of the impetus for the 2 stock model was this notion that we have bay versus coastal fisheries, and the panel was very strongly wanting to recommend against this idea of spatial reference points, and so I highlight it here for your benefit. That does not or should not be synonymized with spatial management. Spatial management is certainly viable and certainly something that I think you have the freedom and flexibility to consider, especially with the revised SCA model. But this idea that you can have a stock, a single biological entity, be experiencing overfishing in one region and not experiencing overfishing in another region simply because it moved based on the season of the year or the age it might have achieved is sort of not biologically meaningful, because cumulative F, or the total fishing mortality experienced by a stock or members of the population, should be what determines an overfishing target, overfishing threshold in the overall reference point framework that you're familiar with. Because there's some infinite ways you can partition F across different regions, different time periods, things like this. So I want to draw a distinction between spatial reference points and spatial management. Spatial reference points are what the panel suggested are not necessarily meaningful. Spatial management, that is changing regulations in one region, changing regulations in another region, is certainly within bounds, because that's a total cumulative F over that biological entity, that stock. So it's not really fair of us as a peer review panel to come in and say we don't accept your model and send you home without any guidance, right? So we spent a lot of the meeting going through questioning the group about why, aspects of this 2 stock model, and I list here some of the ideas and some of the recommendations. We strongly supported continued innovative development of this model. We think it has potential to, with refinement, become one that would pass a peer review panel and thus be the basis for management advice. But just a flavor of some of the things that were discussed were simulation testing. These are, I realize, technical things, but testing different effects of various assumptions regarding movement. Movement ecology of striped bass is extraordinarily complicated, not well understood, yet this model has explicit emigration patterns and movement patterns in it, so there's lots of uncertainty there. There may be advancements with the tagging data to bring things into a spatial framework. Further explanation of some of the tagging data to help with time varying estimation, further exploration of whether or not this biological reference point for a 2 stock model concept with mixing is estimable in a very general sense. When applied, the output for the two stocks wasn't all that different. That seemed curious to us. With all this model complexity and structure embedded, why were the results generally the same for the Delaware stock and the Chesapeake Bay stock? That seemed peculiar to us. Some other assumptions about selectivity, weaknesses of data, stock composition, not to bore you with the technical things, but this was, I think, a very good faith-based effort to provide constructive feedback for the group moving forward on things that we thought would be beneficial moving this model forward. So the rest of my presentation is pretty boring. I just thought in the interest of transparency, I would go through each of the terms of reference associated with what became an evaluation of the single stock traditional SCA model. I'll give you the highlight. We accepted virtually everything. I thought the group did a very good job. There weren't a lot of major criticism or comments moving forward. We think that the group responded very nicely to the SARC 57 recommendations and made some significant advancements. So they did a nice job on terms of reference 1, collating all the life history data, all the fisheries independent data, the surveys as Mike described, the data sources, talking about M. All those data were nicely put together and served as a good starting point. Striped bass are not data poor. Landings, this is probably the most notable advancement. It's been some discussion already this morning about reconfiguring the single species model to have only 2 fleets. That is the Bay fleet with its discards, its recreational component, and its commercial component, and then the non-Bay or coastal fleet with its recreational, commercial, and discards. This is, I think, something that gives you the opportunity to think about spatial management, again, not with spatial reference points. MRIP was here. It's here to stay. We're seeing hundreds of % increases in the new calibrated data. This was not anything new to everybody here. Mike talked about it already. But in general, the group did a nice job characterizing the landings data. This sort of highlights some of the additional commentary regarding the modeling components. The 2 stock model not accepted, single species or single stock model accepted. Bay Fs, as you saw a moment ago, are generally lower than ocean Fs. The SSB pattern was low in the 80s, peaked in 2003, and declined steadily since 2010, leading to the 2017 SSB estimate being on par with that of 1991 or 1992 timeframe, which was when the resource was declared restored. Scientifically speaking, estimates of uncertainty were fairly low, which is a good thing, good precision. And the major diagnostic of these models is this retrospective pattern. And so the team did a retrospective analysis where they peeled off a year of data and re-estimated everything and went back several years in time. And there was a hint of a pattern, but it was certainly not egregious by any means. And the hint of a pattern might suggest a slight overestimation of F and a slight underestimation of SSB, but it wasn't anything that the panel felt was concerning or alarming. It was generally mild in the grand scheme of how bad these patterns can emerge for some assessments. The tagging data, you're well aware of these data. They've been around since the 1980s. There may be some advancements that could be brought along in the tagging arena by bringing multi-state or spatial models to bear there. A lot of work. Those are challenging, but still there's a rich data set that could be utilized. But in general, the tagging data were useful for comparisons of the mortality estimates and the stock size estimates. And will become, actually, I should say, more vital if this 2 stock model continues to move forward, because these are probably the most valuable data sources for understanding stock composition and movements, or at least that are in hand at the moment. The take-home message, as Mike showed, we have a 1995 SSB as the threshold and the associated F that comes along with that. The target's 125% of that threshold, and there's another F that comes along with that. The assessment committee elected to go with, again, these sort of empirical, that is, they're just static numerical values for reference points. An area moving forward might be to consider why the SPR, or the spawning potential ratio, which are reference points that are tied to underpinning the productivity of the resource, are not able to perform well. It's unclear. The group did not have a clear answer, but it's likely that there may be some sex-specific male-female dynamics that are still not well articulated within the modeling framework that could be responsible. So we have empirical reference points. And Mike showed this slide, so we have simple comparison. When you look at the 2017 estimate of SSB, it's below the threshold. And when you look at the 2017 estimate of F, it's above the threshold. So we have a status determination of overfished and overfishing occurring. Projections were run, short-term projections were run under a variety of different scenarios, and virtually all of them showed high probabilities of remaining overfished, greater than 95%. There was some, maybe a little bit more uncertainty regarding the probabilities of maintaining overfishing, but they were generally about 50% depending on some assumptions of the configurations, depending on the recruitment assumptions and things like this. But still, short-term projections suggested, high probabilities of maintaining the current status determination. In general, I think we were very complimentary and positive, even though the outcome may not have been ideal. I think the team did a great job. They did a lot of work, a tremendous amount of work, and the innovation associated with some of the modeling was really great to see. So great progress in SARC 57, and just moving forward, a high priority put on maybe moving that two-stock model forward. So to kind of wrap up, the two-stock model was great but not accepted. The single species model was modified and brought forth in a way that I think made great sense and is a more useful tool for you as a management group. That model was accepted. The outcome, unfortunately, had a overfishing occurring to status determination for 2017. The group had great progress in a lot of areas, and we support their efforts moving forward. So thanks for your time, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Questions for Rob? Jay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Latour. Appreciate the presentation. So one question that I was wondering was, and the answer might be, you got kind of jammed up with going through the model that wasn't accepted and trying to get to the other. But one thing I wondered about is discussions on natural mortality that you may have had. And I guess I'll offer the context of I'm trying to wrap my head around some of the SPR work that was done and why it kind of went off into the stratosphere. And so the reviewers, and you mentioned this, kind of implicated this notion of sex-specific dynamics. The females move out earlier, things like that. But I wondered if natural mortality came up as another discussion. I think it's like a Lorenzen type curve, but scaled to the tagging. And so I'm wondering about the discussion around that, if that was also implicated as a factor in the response to the SPR reference points.
We did not spend a great deal of time talking about M. The Lorenzen curve, as you pointed out, is a commonly accepted approach. It was scaled to tagging, which is also another viable way of estimating natural mortality. So the methodologies underpinning both are well accepted. It was nice to see them treat M as age varying, as opposed to a static singular value for the entire age class or age structure. But you're hinting at what ended up happening. We couldn't dive into some of the details associated with the SPR stuff because there really just wasn't a great deal of time. We spent probably 70% of the meeting on the two-stock model and then had to kind of move along through the single one quickly. But I will say there was nothing alarming with the approach used by the group, and nothing seemed to come up in the discussion with the panel that raised concerns. The SPR stuff likely is tied to the male-female thing. Could be a function of M, could be some other stock dynamic that's occurring there. So I think your intuition is probably correct as the first place to start thinking about it.
Emerson, and then Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Rob, for your presentation. Could you put the slide back up, please, for TOR 6? I had a question on that. The bullet for short-term projections were run under 4 harvest scenarios. Could you expand on that a little bit, please, in terms of what those harvest scenarios were and what the output was?
I might rely on Katie or Mike because I don't remember those scenarios, the details of them, but I'm sure they were under different assumptions of removals. Do you want specific values of those removals? But it was sort of bracketing a status quo, probably a reduction of some kind. I don't know the percentage off the top of my head.
Yeah, we looked at a constant catch scenario, so holding 2017's catch constant. We looked at a constant F scenario, holding 2017's F constant. We also looked at fishing at the threshold, the 0.240, I believe, to get to the 1995 value of SSB. And we also looked at the F value to get to the 1993 value of SSB as well.
So in summary, there's some status quo and then some first cut ideas at getting back to threshold or target values from the reference points.
Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Rob, thank you for your presentation. I'm having a little trouble figuring out a couple of the comments that were made, specifically about the spatial reference points being not biologically meaningful. And so, but there's also an optimism that this two-stock model could be something for the future. So I'm wondering how to bridge the gap between what the peer review is saying about the meaningfulness of reference, spatial reference points, spatial management are certainly something that we're highly interested in pursuing for future management. And I wonder if you can comment about how we can get from a point where a peer review is saying something isn't meaningful, yet it's optimistic that it can ultimately achieve, it can get there someday. And then after that, Mr. Chairman, I have one more follow-up on reference points. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you for the question regarding clarification. So we're scientists, and models are cool. So a lot of this modeling was very innovative and very interesting, but there's still some fundamental biological things that the single stock model overlooks. That is, you have two genetically, possibly more, but at least two genetically isolated stocks that each likely have their own underpinning life history and life cycle. The Delaware stock may have an entirely different reproductive strategy, may have a different recruitment strategy than the Bay, and all of these sort of things, which are not accounted for in this one stock model. So from an analytical point of view, building in the two stock structure was very attractive from that perspective because it allows that flexibility to play out. Regarding reference points being spatial, if you have a single stock, it's a single biological entity, right? So in this room, we are the ASMFC participants of this meeting for this day, and we could say, well, there's enough of us, there's an adequate number to move our agenda forward. If we all split up and go into separate rooms, every room itself might not have enough, but there's still collectively enough to move the agenda forward. Where you're located doesn't really matter because you've achieved a certain threshold of having enough abundance, if you will, by analogy, versus maybe spatially there's not enough room for us to conduct our business most efficiently here, so we need to move ourselves around and do different things to go different places because that's a better way of managing how we're going to move forward. So from that point of view, we're managing ourselves spatially, but we're not saying anything about whether there's enough of us to move it forward or not. So this idea that the Chesapeake stock could be overfished in the Bay and not overfished in the ocean or vice versa doesn't make sense because it's the underlying biological productivity of the stock that defines what's allowable in terms of removals and what's balancing that with its own productivity. I'm not sure if that analogy helps, but that's sort of where we were as a group, on that comment. Spatial management is different than spatial reference points.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for that, and it helps me get a little bit closer to understanding. And I guess my follow-up question to your comments is that, I'm aware staff have informed me that even through the single stock model, that reference points were generated for both Chesapeake Bay and the coastal fishery. And is the reasoning you just gave the reason why the peer review, even under a one stock model, wouldn't be suggesting those for management use?
Exactly. Because again, you have a single stock now, not separate ones being treated in the same model, so it's exactly the same logic that would apply.
One more question, Mr. Chairman, if that's okay. Regarding the reference points that we're currently using, there was some discussion in the peer review about the 1993 reference point. We've had concerns over the reference points for quite some time. In our minds, they're a bit too high. I think they provide for an unrealistic expectation to the public that we're going to be able to achieve that level. Currently, the threshold reference point is 91,000 metric tons, and 125% of that puts us at a target value. And when you look at the spawning stock biomass, the estimates of spawning stock biomass that came out of the benchmark, we have never achieved the target in all of that time as we're evaluating that. So with that said, I also understand thresholds as being something where the stock is in what I would think is considerable trouble. And when I look back as to when that threshold was developed, a date was chosen, a period of time was chosen when the stock was considered recovered. And so, it's difficult to communicate with stakeholders about the appropriateness of thresholds and targets when you have a threshold that you think the stock is in trouble, but it was at the same time when it was recovered, and then you have a target that you never have achieved. And I just wonder if you could expand a little bit on the discussion about the 1993 empirical point in time and whether or not you would think that well, I'll hear your comment, but whether or not you would consider that to be maybe a more appropriate threshold and target moving forward. Thanks.
As a panel, we did not challenge the choice of reference points. There's a history of them, and from the panel's perspective, unless there's some obvious modeling type failure or problem with the assessment that would be tied to the choice of reference point, it's generally not the place of the peer review panel to do that, only if it was sort of linked to some sort of scientific failure, at least in my view. And that's kind of how the peer review panel that we had for this assessment viewed it as well. I personally would have liked to have seen in the SPR's work. I think you have a conceptual divide here. You have an empirical based reference point that, as you say, is a marker in the sand. It's not tied to the biological processes of the resource, and that's where the SPRs offer some different insight. They're not working. They're giving drastically unrealistic estimates of abundance in SSB. Just cannot pass the red face test type scale of the estimates. So there's something inherently off there, and it would be nice to understand why. But usually, it's nice to have an empirical marker or something that's tied to the underlying biology to give you a sense of whether the empirical is based in a reasonable level of what the resource can sustain moving forward in terms of removal. So, long comment here perhaps, but we didn't spend a lot of time discussing it, and we just assumed that this is what the management regime and the management system was happy with. So it wasn't necessarily our place to suggest otherwise.
Rob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Rob. I guess I'm interested about the recruitment stream or vector that when the projections were done, was it the entire time series of recruitment data? And if not, were there other time periods looked at before the complete time series? How did that work?
I'll take a stab at my memory. I believe the full time series was used. Random draws from the full time series. Cast forward.
So we looked at two different
a
hockey stick recruitment relationship. And just to be clear, is your question regarding the migration model or the migration model? So for the migration model, we used the full stock recruitment relationship for the Chesapeake stock, We felt like the asymptotic recruitment had been reached for the Chesapeake stock. For the combined Delaware Hudson stock, we used what we termed this hockey stick recruitment relationship, where didn't believe we had reached asymptotic recruitment in that stock. It was more of sort of an ascending relationship. So we used model predicted, Beverton Holt model predicted recruitment through median SSB, and then median recruitment for SSB greater than that for the migration model. As an alternative, we looked at random recruitment draws from just 1990 forward, the period of time during which the stock was restored but not recovered, as a sort of a sensitivity analysis.
Further questions? Sorry, Justin, yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for that presentation, Rob. I'm curious, when you look at the landscape of data gaps and information gaps that led the peer review to conclude that the two-stock model couldn't pass, can all those readily be addressed with the existing data sources we have with, as you indicated, maybe just more simulation work or just accumulation of longer time series? Or do states need to be thinking about initiating new data collection or research survey efforts to produce new sources of information that we don't currently have?
Right. Thank you. It's a good question. I do recall the panel having some discussion saying that it would be wise for the management body, the management system, to integrate with the TC regarding whether or not this is the direction they want to go, because there are some different data configurations that the two-stock model would require. I think several of those can be dealt with extant data. I don't necessarily think major new data collection programs need to be initiated, but there's the human resource time allocation issue, and so which way does the management system want to go in terms of its technical supporting information? So there may be some worthwhile effort devoted to prioritization of the modeling tools and the things that you want to see for what you're envisioning management-wise moving forward, because I think that would help guide TC and stock assessment folks with respect to what they're going to tackle next. But in general, striped bass, as you know, are very data rich. You have one of the longest tagging data sets in the history of fish tagging, to be blunt. It's one of the most rich in terms of the number tagged and the length of recoveries and things. There's a wealth of information there that can aid the two-stock model in terms of movements and stock composition type questions. There's a ton of simulation work that could be done that's all analytical computer time that could advance estimability questions that the panel had. So I think a lot of it can be dealt with resources currently in place. It's a matter of prioritization. And as a general comment, I've been around enough to know that when you bring a new model online, there's always skepticism. So I don't think that this lack of acceptance of the two-stock model should be viewed as some sort of criticism of the group or a fault of anyone in particular. It's just there's reticence to bring on a new modeling tool because unless it's been fully vetted, and quite frankly, fully vetted means can take years, in terms of developing it. It starts out in its infancy and it grows, and at some point it reaches a threshold where everybody feels comfortable. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's just a natural progression, and we've started it now, or you've started it with this two-stock model. It's a matter of whether you want to continue it.
Jay, then John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe I'll start off with a comment based on what Dr. Latoro was just saying, just to support. I think this idea of bringing in new modeling approaches, having them run kind of parallel, it's a good process. It allows you to do these cross comparisons and to get multiple reviews done on them. We did a similar thing with black sea bass. And so I think that process is great. I applaud the group for getting it to the peer review, and I hope you continue to carry it forward. So that was a quick comment. My question is probably not for Dr. Latoro, maybe for Mike. And I was hoping to put notions of uncertainty and risk in a little bit of context. One thing that wasn't clear to me in the projections that you did, there are these, envelopes of uncertainty. There's been a comment or two made about, 95% probability of not reaching the target, that sort of thing. I know that you tested stochasticity in recruitment. You also had the two different methods that you talked about. But what I was wondering is, was there stochasticity put on any other elements in the projections like catch or anything like that? So when we're looking at that uncertainty, are we only considering recruitment uncertainty in that projection?
Another place that we incorporate uncertainty is where the projections start. So we're taking the initial abundances at age and sampling from a normal distribution from each of those starting values based on the standard errors, the model estimates of standard errors. So we're incorporating some variability from where those projections are starting, and then incorporating recruitment variability in addition to that.
So thank you for that, Mike. And so just to confirm, so you are doing some sort of bootstrap routine where you're kind of grabbing from some reasonable sense of variability around the terminal year estimates and then pitching those forward.
Yep, exactly. We have estimates of abundance at age and standard error around those estimates at age. So we're sampling from a normal distribution based on that standard error from each abundance at age.
Awesome. Thank you.
John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I don't want to get caught up on this. I think there's plenty of time to get caught up on it later. And hopefully this is a quick question, quick answer. But to Mike's reference points comments, I understand that we're dealing with empirical rather than biological reference points. What was the rationale for 1995 as the rebuilt year? And is there any reason to believe, based on JAIs and other information that we have, that we can't get back there?
From the perspective of the peer review panel, those were on the books as pre-existing, so the rationale was never really brought to bear. I think you may want to, your question may be dating back to times prior to the most recent assessment review. Mike?
And maybe Katie can give us the best background on the invention of those.
I certainly think there's other people around the table who've been here longer in terms of why that was declared the restored period. But it was related to the JAI trends over time, as well as sort of the condition of the stock, the age structure of the stock later, when we were able to estimate that through the assessment process. But it was based predominantly on the JAI index over time. And so there's no biological reason that we can't get back there. That product that SSB was the product of good years of strong recruitment and low fishing mortality. But it is within the biological capacity of the stock to show those kinds of year classes again, even now.
And just one quick comment on that. In the last 10 years, we've had 4 pretty good JAIs. So I hope the board keeps that in mind.
Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't hear this morning any discussion of F-based estimates or tag-based estimates of F, and I was wondering if Dr. Latour or Mike, my reading of the stock assessment, I recall values for the tag-based estimates of F of 0.07, 0.09, somewhere in that range. And how do we reconcile those differences compared to the SCA model estimates of F? And what should we do with that? It seems like every assessment, we have these independent F-based estimates of F. And my recollection is we never know exactly how to reconcile them. Are we any closer to that now? Thank you.
I think with the tagging committee and the stock assessment subcommittee sort of makes of those very low F estimates is that they're likely unrealistically low. We think it has a lot to do with the reporting rate. The reporting rate in the tagging model helps partition total mortality into fishing mortality and natural mortality. So the natural mortality tends to be a little bit higher than we think is realistic, and Fs tend to be a little lower than we think is realistic. So we instead look at just the total trends in total mortality, and they're really good. And so when we look at those trends, not looking at the distinction between F and M, but just total mortality, we see a high degree of overlap between the tagging model and the statistical catch-at-age model, and we also saw this, another sort of line of evidence of support for the migration model was we saw similar trends with the migration model as well. So we, at least right now, one of our primary research recommendations that we have in the assessment document and the tagging committee has talked about for a number of years is trying to get a really good handle on reporting rate that we think will help really tease apart that distinction between F and M.
I can add a little bit to that too. I think, I mean, as someone who started their career working on tagging models, I've published on the darn things, and I would echo Mike's comments in that unless the situation regarding the meeting the assumptions of the methods can be truly met, then there's likelihood that they're missing a lot of what's going on because they're relying on a very simple process. You tag 100 animals, 10 of them, you get 10 returns back. That means 90 have survived, 10 have died. You can figure out the mortality rate very quickly. Missing from that is all the catch activity, all the landings, all the underlying biology. There's no biology in those methods, and such that I don't think unless there's a data poor situation that tagging emerges to the top of the list as a tool for formalized assessments. It's a nice complementary tool. It gives you insight into comparability and cross modeling, that sort of thing. But relying on this catch-at-age model is by far your best tool for supporting management activities moving forward.
Go ahead, Roy.
Quick follow-up. Is the principal weakness in the tag-based estimates the fact that tag reporting is variable and not well known? Is that the principal problem?
That is a major problem. There's other things called mixing. So in order for the tagging response, the information you get from the tagging data regarding survival or mortality to be representative of what the entire population is doing, recognizing that we're tagging 0.1%, 1,000 animals tagged in a year is really great, but that's way low compared to what the total population size is. So what we require is for every one of those tagged animals to be perfectly mixed with the untagged animals, behaviorally, age, size, male, female, all of those classifications. And if there's any divergence there, then you're getting a false sense of what the mortality rate of the population is because it's based only on those tagged population animals. So that's another one that's very hard to validate or assumption that's very hard to control for. We hope it's there, but it's very difficult to know. So there's the fisher behavior side of it, like will a fisher return the tag if it's in their hand, and that's a behavioral thing, and we'd like to know that. Maybe we have a better chance of knowing that. But then there's the biological side of what we're attempting to do with the tagging program in general.
Rob O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just a point of information. I'm not sure I heard everything Katie was saying earlier, but I think there was an inference about the recovery and the average of the 1960 to 1972 spawning stock biomass was what that was all based on. And the technical committee at that time was very pleased when that milestone was reached.
Any other questions for Rob or Mike? Did I see? Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are you ready for a motion?
I thought I had to say something first, but go right ahead.
I was helping you move it along. I'm taking over the Pat Augustine role of New York. So, move to accept the 2018 striped bass stock assessment And peer review report for management use.
Do we have a second? Second, Richie White. Let me read that into the record. Move to accept the 2018 striped bass stock assessment and peer review report for management use. Discussion. Seeing none. Is there any opposition? Seeing none, we approve the motion by consensus. Thank you. Moving on. Now that we have a benchmark assessment and a peer review, we need to consider management responses to this. I think the first point is we need, Nicole will present a response from the technical committee to our requests for what was needed to achieve fishing mortality reductions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today I'll be presenting a technical committee report on the tasks assigned by the board at the last board meeting. I'll start by going over some background information, and then I'm going to present each task assigned by the board, and for each task I'll review the methods, results, and the technical committee comments. At the February 2019 board meeting, the board was presented with preliminary findings of the 2018 benchmark assessment. Those findings, which we just reviewed again today, found that SSB in 2017 was estimated at 151 million pounds of fish, which is below the threshold of 202 million pounds, resulting in an overfish status. Fishing mortality in 2017 was estimated at 0.31, which is greater than the threshold of 0.24, meaning that we are also in an overfishing status. As a result of these findings, the board passed the following motion. Move to task the technical committee with providing the board with a report that shows the reductions in harvest needed to reduce F to F threshold and F target, and also provide one example of recreational bag and size limit combination and, if necessary, seasonal restrictions needed to achieve these conditions, A, on the coast, and B, in the Chesapeake Bay, and report back to the board in May. The first task from that motion that I'll review are the projections that were done to estimate what total removals need to be in 2020 to have a 50% probability of bringing fishing mortality back down to the target and threshold. For the projections, the technical committee had to make several assumptions, the first of that being that any management would not be implemented until 2020. Next, because estimates of commercial removals for 2018 to 2020 are not yet available, the technical committee assumed that commercial landings would be the average ratio of commercial removals to total removals for the period of 2015 to 2017, with commercial removals including landings and discards. For recreational removals for 2018 to 2020, the technical committee assumed that 2018 removals would be equal to the preliminary 2018 MRIP estimates. For 2019, we looked at two different scenarios. The first scenario was assuming that 2019 removals would be equal to the 2018 preliminary MRIP estimates. And the second scenario was assuming that 2019 removals would be equal to the average removals from 2016 through 2018. That three-year average was chosen to capture the variability in landings over the three-year time period. Under both those scenarios, we got very similar results. From the projections, it was estimated that total removals in 2020 need to be 7.1 million fish to achieve F threshold, which is a 0% reduction from 2017. And total removals need to be 5.9 million fish in 2020 to achieve F target, which is a 17% reduction in total removals from 2017. For these projections, there's a 50% probability of achieving the target and threshold. For all scenarios, the spawning stock biomass was projected to be below the target and threshold in 2020. This plot shows female spawning stock biomass over time in metric tons and shows that by 2020, spawning stock biomass is expected to increase slightly, but will still be below both the target and the threshold. The TC had several comments related to the uncertainties in these projections. At this point, 2018 recreational data are still preliminary, and assumptions had to be made about what 2019 removals are expected to be, as well as commercial landings and discards for 2018 and 2019. Additionally, preliminary recreational landings in 2018 decreased by 25% compared to 2017 with no management changes, adding to the uncertainty. This decrease was likely due to a decrease in total effort and directed trips. This is a plot of recreational removals over time in millions of fish. And as you can see from the preliminary estimate for 2018, the black bar, it's quite low, and it hasn't been that low since about the mid-1990s when the stock was declared rebuilt. The next task assigned by the board was to provide an example recreational option to bring F back down to the target and threshold. As mentioned, the projection showed that we needed a 17% reduction in total removals in 2020 to have a 50% probability of bringing F back down to the target and threshold. For this exercise, to come up with an example recreational option, the TC assumed that reductions would be taken from both the recreational and commercial fisheries in order to achieve that overall 17% reduction in total removals. It's at the board's discretion to decide how they want reductions to be allocated to the different sectors, but for this exercise, the technical committee made this assumption, and therefore we looked at an example for the ocean and the Chesapeake Bay to achieve a 17% reduction in total removals relative to 2017 to achieve F target. On the coast, we're currently at a one fish bag limit, so looking at a reduced bag wasn't an option. Seasons vary drastically along the coast depending on the jurisdiction, so only a size limit analysis for simplicity was conducted for the coast. In the Chesapeake Bay, the bag limit reduction resulted in a decrease greater than 17%. And the season analysis had many options that would achieve 17%. So again, for simplicity and for ease of comparison to the ocean, only the size limit analysis is presented. Length frequency data from 2016 to 2017 was used as it was thought to be most representative of the population size structure in 2020. In 2016 and 2017, the 2011 year class was about the same age as the 2014 and 2015 year classes are expected to be in 2020. Maryland and Virginia have different size limits at the present, so separate analyses were conducted for each state. Maryland was at 20 inches for 2016 to 2017 and then decreased to 19 inches in 2018. The proportion of 19-inch fish had to be estimated as the average proportion from 2000 to 2014 when the minimum size was 18 inches. The results show that to achieve a 17% reduction in the recreational fishery by 2020, the coast would have to increase their minimum size from 28 inches to 35 inches. Maryland would have to increase their minimum size from 19 inches to 21 inches, and Virginia would have to increase their minimum size from 20 inches to 22 inches. Increasing the minimum size will increase dead discards approximately 3 to 4%, but the reduction in harvest offsets this. The proportion of total removals made up of dead discards also increases due to the small increase in dead discards and the larger reduction in harvest. The TC made several assumptions in the size limit analysis, including the availability of different size classes will be the same, and there will be no changes in effort or angler behavior. Realized reductions could end up being very different from what was estimated, with fishing mortality and removals varying under constant regulations. We've seen this with Addendum 4, where we initially saw a decrease in harvest following implementation in 2015. We subsequently saw an increase in harvest in 2016 and 2017, and now again we've seen another decline in harvest by 25% in 2018. The technical committee did discuss season changes as a way to reduce harvest, but noted that with reduced seasons, dead discards are likely to increase, as anglers will target other sport fish and still encounter striped bass, and anglers may switch to catch and release. And with that, we can take any questions. Thank you.
Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Nicole. I have a question. I'm trying to equate something on this. One of our past slides, and it's in this packet too, from the SAW, says we essentially have on catch and release, we keep 40. It's about a 50-50 balance. It's 48-42 on how many die versus how many are kept alive when we harvest because of catch and release. So we essentially, for catch and release, we kill more than we keep. And a summary in your results says if we go up from 28 inches to 35, which to me seems like a lot more catch and release to get to that 35, will only increase mortality by 3%. Those numbers just don't seem to add up to me.
So in doing those calculations, we're not accounting for any changes in angler behavior. So we're just taking the savings from those 28 to 34-inch fish that will no longer be caught and applying a 9% discard mortality to those fish. We're not adding any additional mortality from a catch and release fishery that might occur.
And to add to that, you have to keep in mind that 10 times as many fish are released alive as are kept for this fishery. So yes, half of the mortality on the recreational side comes from those fish that are released alive, but that's because 10 times as many fish are being released alive as are being retained. So when we reduce the harvest, the number of dead discards increases by about 3% because 90% of those fish that we release alive now live, as opposed to being died and being harvested the way they were before. So that's why, yes, there is a lot of released mortality in this fishery, but that is because of the number of trips that are taken that release alive so many fish.
We have lots of people to get to. Justin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nicole, I'm wondering if you can comment a bit on the choice of 2017 as the reference year to calculate percent reductions, rather than using 2018.
So the technical committee looked at 2017 and 2018. When we looked at both of those years, 2017 presented the largest reduction that would be necessary, and so the most extreme case. So we chose that to present. When we look at 2018, it appears that there may be no reduction necessary, and because of the great disparity between 2018 and 2017, we thought, let's just present the most extreme of those cases.
Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nicole, just out of curiosity, what was the percent reduction for dropping the bag limit in the Chesapeake Bay?
I don't have the exact number in front of me, but I believe it was on the order of 30%, somewhere in that realm.
Rob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think last meeting there were at least a half a dozen comments about the dead discards. And I did not look back that far, but I looked back to 2006 when the fishery was doing very well and the stock was doing very well, and there were a lot of dead discards then as well. So if you happen to have something that shows the time series of dead discards, it may be important for all of us to realize that that's the way this fishery has been, prosecuted over the years. It's not something new. But I don't know whether you have anything like that handy or not.
So this graph is from our last meeting's assessment, and it's showing the APIS calibrations, but it's also relevant that you can see the harvest on the left and the live releases on the right. And notice this again. Notice the scale difference, that there is literally an order of magnitude larger on the live release side. And so we assume that about 9% of those die, bringing them down to essentially equivalent to the magnitude of the of the harvest over the entire time series.
Iveric?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, under the scenario you presented, you're saying there's going to be a 3 to 4% increase in dead discards. Is that 3 to 4% of 9%, or is it in total, which would be a 33 to 44% increase relative to 9?
So the way we calculated that is that we have the number of dead releases in 2017, so that's 9% of that, and then we calculated how many of those fish that were no longer legal harvest that would be thrown back would die, and that resulted in a 3 to 4% increase in the dead discards. So compared to the level of dead discards that we estimated for 2017, in 2020, the result would be about 3 to 4% higher. So that's the total number of dead discards would be 3 to 4% higher, not the mortality rate itself.
So then that means dead discards would go up somewhere between 33 and 44%.
No, the total number of fish that would be released alive would go up a lot. But of the dead releases, of the fish that actually die as a result of that, it's only about 3 to 4% different from what it was in 2017. So the total, including the ones that we assumed before would have been released alive, as well as the new ones that are released alive, that difference of the dead more releases is only 3 to 4%.
The 9% discard mortality has already been applied to those fish.
Sarah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you're looking at dead discards, are you taking into account the effects of climate change and the warming of whether it's Buzzards Bay or Chesapeake Bay or the Delaware Bay, and whether a stressed fish that is released into ever-warming waters, if we're going to see a trend for more dead discards as we're seeing the trend up for warming waters?
So in this case, for this analysis, no, we only applied a constant 9% release mortality across the entire population. We do recognize that there's certain times of years and certain situations where that is different. There's also times of years where that is lower. So that 9% is kind of an average for the overall population. It's something we could consider looking into as we go forward, but when we've tried in the past to kind of get more spatial or temporal better estimates of release mortality, we found it's very hard to kind of connect the when and where that fish is being released with enough detail in terms of water temperature to relate that back to what we know about the relationship between release mortality and water temperature. But it could, in the future, it could have a larger impact.
All right. I got Mike and John and Tom and Jay and Andy. Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Nicole, for your presentation. Just a quick question. Are we just still doing questions at this point, or are you entertaining comments as well?
Let's keep it to questions right now.
Okay, great. So my question, Nicole, is in your report, you were specific in that the calculations and the percent reduction that would be required to achieve a 17% reduction in total removals was a combination of all the sectors involved, so both recreational and commercial sectors. And I wondered if, would it be possible as a follow-up action to take a look at and analyze each of those sectors independently if one were removed from the equation, meaning that if it were going to be the case at some point that we would be considering perhaps removing the commercial fishery from being part of this addendum due to its I guess, size in comparison to the recreational fishery, would it be possible then to calculate reductions solely based on a recreational fishery if that was going to be what was going to take the reductions?
If the board decides to task the technical committee or the plan development team with that, we can certainly calculate that. If the commercial fishery is not involved, it's definitely going to change. It could change the numbers slightly, but we would have to look at that, and we certainly can look at that.
Go ahead, Mike. Just a quick follow-up, but that wasn't anything that you guys discussed at this time. You would need further tasking at this time for that?
Correct. We were just tasked with providing the example, and we chose applying the 17% to both sectors as we didn't have any other clear guidance on how to allocate the percent reduction, and that's what was done for Addendum 4. So we thought for this simple exercise, that would be the most simple approach, but we would be looking any future tasks that the board assigns, clear definition on how you want to see those allocations to each sector would be helpful.
John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing I'm not clear on is the board tasked the TC with developing percent reduction that would get us back to F target. But as far as I'm aware, there was no discussion about what would get us back to SSB target. Now, my question is, is F target calculated to get us to SSB target, or are the two things independent? And do we need to be discussing an F rebuild?
Theoretically, yes. Your F target is supposed to be the level of fishing mortality that gets you to your spawning stock biomass target. It's on what time frame are you talking about, though? So on the short term, when we look at the slide that we had presented, by 2020, we do see an increase, but by 2020, we'll not be back up at the target.
Go ahead.
No, I understand that, and thank you. But my question was, were the calculations done given, say, average juvenile abundance indices, that this F target would get us to SSB target within 10 years?
So we did not do any long-term projections looking at past 2020. The example that we looked at was strictly what do removals need to be in 2020 to get back to F target, and that resulted in the 17% reduction.
Thank you. Okay, that's good to know, but I would just remind the board that part of that second trigger in Amendment 6 is to not only address overfishing, but to rebuild. So it's something we need to think about moving forward. Thanks.
Tom Fode.
In the benchmark stock assessment, there's a chart that shows the commercial discards, the recreational discards, both harvested and discards. Could you put that table up for me, please? It's in yellow, gray, and spots, you know. It's a bar graph. Yeah, that's the one I'm looking at. Now, we keep saying it's the hook and release mortality is 52 and catch is 48. If I'm looking at the last 3 years, maybe I'm reading this wrong, I look at the hook and release mortality in 15 was 6.5 million, where the catch was only about 4 million. In 16, it was 7.5 million by the catch and release mortality to 3.5. And in 17, it was even more difference. So it's really not 52-48 anymore, according to those last 3 years. And I don't know what it is in 2018. I'm hoping you have the numbers for 2018. But it looks to me like the catch and release mortality actually makes about 2/3 of the catch, the kill. And about 1/3 is actually the harvest. So when you keep saying 42 to 48, if I'm looking at this correctly, it's a lot larger than that in the last 3 years.
So I can tell you that in 2018, dead recreational releases accounted for 49% of total removals and 55% of recreational removals.
Okay. So explain those charts to me that they don't basically add up to those figures. Because according to those charts, the hook and release mortality is much greater than the catch. It's not on a 42 to 55.
So the numbers that I just gave you were 2018, and this plot only goes through 2017.
Yeah. But on these 3 years, it's a lot larger numbers than that. Am I right or wrong?
It's not. That's the correct number for 2017. It's true that in the most recent couple of years, it has been higher than it has in the past, and that's a combination of some of the management changes and also a couple of strong year classes moving through, so that when we have more stronger year classes moving through, we generally have higher release rates on that. But this is the data that we have.
It doesn't add up to the chart, though. That's what I'm trying to figure out. If the numbers are there, and I'm looking at the numbers, they don't add up to what you're putting up there.
Jay.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I think I'm maybe on the same theme here. One of the comments made about the projections, and Nicole, nice presentation, by the way, sorry. One of the comments you made, Nicole, was you used you sort of projected some size structure that you expect in 2020. So I'm curious if I'm understanding that correctly. Are you guys making an assumption about those recruitment events in 2015, 2016, and kind of pushing those fish forward in some way? And the reason just to put my question in context, I'm wondering, we're talking about reductions in expectations of discards and things like that, and I'm wondering if you have gotten us to a better point with that expectation by doing something like that, by propagating forward 2015 and 2016. Maybe they're not old enough yet, it's only a couple of years, but that's maybe you understand my question. I'm wondering how you projected that size structure for 2020.
So I'll let Mike take this because he actually did the projection.
But so yes, we're starting the projection in 2017, so we have some information on cohort strength from the previous cohorts, and we're projecting that forward. So yeah, I think to the extent that we can, we are accounting for those cohorts coming through the population. It's a sort of, the projections are a kind of a continuation of our catch at age model, so we're projecting those cohorts forward. Does that help?
And so then on the example regulation size, we're also accounting for the year class in that and how that's going to impact dead releases. That's why we chose the 2016 and 2017 years, because we're expecting that the 2014 and 15 year classes are going to be the same age as the 2011 year class was. So we're kind of accounting for it in the example regulations as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Andy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nicole, the TC chose to limit. Are we good? Okay. The TC chose to limit the analysis to minimum length rather than season limits or bag limits. And so my question is, did the TC consider maximum length limits or slot limits? And if not, why not? Thank you.
So we did not look at a slot limit. The TC thought that for this, because it was just an example exercise, that the easiest option was just to look at a straight increase in size limit.
Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is similar to one that Mike Luisi asked, and it was partially answered. So I'm wondering why the technical committee chose to take a reduction for both the commercial fishery and the recreational fishery, because my recollection of our discussion back in February was really about the recreational catch, and even more so the recreational dead discards. And I was under the assumption, and maybe I'm the only one, perhaps other people have a different view, that the task that we were asking the technical committee to perform was relative to the, or both parts of that motion were relative to the recreational fishery.
The technical committee discussed it. We were unclear from the board's motion whether those reductions were to come from the recreational fishery alone or apply to both sectors. So we chose to make the assumption that equal reductions would come from each side, as this was just an example. If you were to look at just the recreational fishery and not take any reductions on the commercial side, that 17% would be higher. I don't know exactly what that number would be, but it would be greater than 17%. So you would be looking at greater than 35 inches on the coast and greater than the minimum sizes in Maryland and Virginia as well.
Richie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Following up on what Jay was asking about, we projected the 2011 year class going forward, and did that turn out to be, has the 2011 year class turned out to be what we projected it to be at this point?
So yeah, the model still thinks that was a very strong year class, and if you look at the catch at age, you can see that 2011 year class is more abundant relative to the other ages around it going through. I think we didn't hit we only hit our removal target in 1 year out of the 3 years that we had under Addendum 4, and so as a result, I think the full benefits of that were not as realized as the projections would have suggested if we'd managed to maintain that harvest reduction through 16 and 17 as well as 15.
Justin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to return to the topic of using the 2016-17 size structure data for harvest and catch for making or formulating the new regulations, I would agree that that's a good choice because of the issue of the 2011 year class was at about the same point then as the 14 and 15 year classes will be in 2020, but in 2020 we'll have not one but 2 year classes, strong year classes, starting to come into the fishery, make themselves sort of known. So I would guess that might be one reason to believe that the projections of dead discards with the higher minimum length limit might be a little bit conservative. It's possible we might have more discards than projected with those 2 year classes coming in.
Yeah, that absolutely goes into the uncertainties with these exercises. You're basically assuming that your population size is going to stay the same, and even though we chose those years for the link frequency to kind of incorporate that a little bit, it is very uncertain.
Russ.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When we were here in February, and I want to back up what Emerson said, everyone was aghast that we had 48% dead discards in the recreational fishery. And it looks to me at this point that we're going to punish the commercial for doing a good job. And as the chart reads, 2% dead discards, and even if it goes up to 10%, that the problem we have is in the recreational fishery. And I was just wondering why we didn't concentrate on what the meeting in February was all about. Thank you.
Yeah, again, the motion did ask explicitly for a recreational measure to achieve F target, but there was no guidance on how to apply those reductions to the two sectors. And so the TC used Addendum 4 as a template, which applied those reductions equally to the commercial and recreational sectors. And that's what they did with this example, right, to set the stage for a management response discussion.
Thank you for that. I will never guarantee that if we go with this and raising the size, that your dead discards are going to be much higher than 48%. Thank you.
So we just wanted to reiterate that this is an example option, and also that the motion tasked us with looking at reductions in harvest needed to achieve F and F threshold. It wasn't specific to recreational harvest. That's why we made that assumption.
All right. Rob, go ahead.
Will you take a comment, Mr. Chairman? Or is it still questions?
Still questions, but we are right on the fringe of comments.
Can I break through the fringe?
Are there any further questions for Nicole about the work that she did? John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One quick question here. It looks like the TC did calculate the effects of the 2015 year class entering the fishery, and if I'm understanding correctly, that's not something we did with Addendum 4 with the 2011s. Is that correct?
The problem was with the 2011 that we ran into was that there had not been a strong year class in the last 5 or 6 years before that 2011 year class came through. So we essentially had no historical data in order to provide a proxy length frequency. And that was certainly something that we were concerned about when we did that analysis for the board.
Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for that answer. So with that analysis in mind, we're not expecting that sort of jump in recreational landings in the Bay States with a 21 or 22-inch limit?
I think this analysis is probably going to be closer than the previous analysis was, but we can't guarantee that there will not be a difference.
Tom.
Yeah, I think I finally figured out this chart and why I was making a different comparison to you than you were. If I'm reading this and Joe's trying to explain to me, what the chart shows, it should be better explained, is that bar is not what the individual catches are. It shows the accumulation of the 3 catches. So that's what because usually when I'm looking at a bar graph like this, when I see that yellow line, that's the number of the yellow line that's basically, that's why it's a confusing chart. And that's why I was having a problem. I better understand it now. Now I understand where you're getting the numbers. But if I just look at that chart, I'm not getting it. And I've been doing this a long time. And when I get confused, I feel how the public must get confused. So when we put up a chart like that, we've got to explain it better that this is the percentage of one. So you combine all 3 of them, that makes up your 100%. Am I right or wrong now?
You are correct. They're stacked on top of each other.
So I apologize, but I was confused. And I figure if I'm confused, I really got to find the answer for it. Thank you.
All right. Further questions? We're starting to get into the comment phase. Before we do that, Max has a very brief presentation to guide us in terms of addendum versus amendment and the timelines involved and what we should be thinking, because that would be the first order of business. Is, are we going to addendum or amendment, and how do we approach it? Arnold, I'm going to hold off on public comment till we have perhaps a motion, because we've been all over the place. I'd like to bring us back a little bit. So, a question. Okay, Arnold.
Yeah, thank you. Arnold Leo. I represent the fishing industry of the town of East Hampton. And since I'm paid to be here to do that, I appreciate getting a couple of minutes to address you and ask a question which I think needs to be clearly answered. As I understand it, the overfishing has occurred entirely in the recreational sector. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're unable to determine stock status by sector. We have an area sort of an area partial fleet, partial F, rather than a sector partial F. So we're unable to develop stock status by sector.
Yeah, no, not stock status. The landings that accounted for overfishing occurred entirely in the recreational sector. True or false?
We do have a time series of landings by sector. That is true. We have a time series of that we can. I don't think we have that in this presentation, but we can make that available.
I can't understand your answer, but it's not an answer.
Arnold, we will come back to the question of commercial versus rec, and we'll take comments then.
Why can't I get an answer to that simple question at this point?
The answer has never been calculated, so there is one that could be derived. The current stock assessment does not allow that question to be answered, thus it remains unknown.
Okay, however, it seems to me that's the essential question when it comes to what measures should we take to address the problem. So I would beseech you in the next few minutes to come up with an answer to that question so we would know for sure where the curtailment of effort has to be applied. Thank you.
Thank you. Rob, can your comments hold off after Max?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Max, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, just a couple slides here to highlight some of the issues that could be considered in an addendum or an amendment, and also to review a few possible action timelines. So as it's been discussed over this last few agenda items, by accepting the new benchmark assessment for management use, the triggers in the plan relating to fishing mortality threshold and the biomass threshold have been tripped. So the board is required to adjust the management program to reduce F to a level at or below target within 1 year, and to rebuild biomass to the target, and that rebuilding schedule cannot exceed a 10-year period. The adaptive management section in Amendment 6 is very flexible. There's a lot of issues that could be considered in an addendum, and so it's very important that the board provide good direction to the development team on which issues to consider, and also on how those issues should be approached or explored. Looking at the regulatory program, for example, if the board tasked the PDT to look at new measures for the recreational sector, it would go back and look at bag limits and size limits, because that's currently what manages the recreational sector. If the board wanted to look at a coast-wide season or regional seasons, that direction would need to be explicit. Similar for the commercial sector, it's managed through size limits and quotas. If a seasonal aspect wanted to, the board wanted to explore that would also have to be explicit. Sort of along the lines of developing alternative regulations, we would also need some guidance on how to apply those reductions to the different sectors. I think that's definitely a topic that's been discussed around the table already. Also, a regional allocation of fishing mortality. If you use Addendum 4 as an example, there was different reductions taken for the Chesapeake Bay and the coast. However, within those two regions, the reductions were applied relatively equally to the commercial and recreational sectors. So guidance along the regional breakdown and also the sector breakdown would be needed. There's a number of other issues that can be considered in an addendum. This list is not exhaustive by any means. It's just a few of the issues that have been raised at this table over the last few meetings. Reference points, management triggers, those would sort of be tied together. Monitoring requirements, looking at some of the recommendations that came out of the benchmark assessment, a little coordination with the technical committee to see if our data needs are being met for the new two-stock model or other assessment needs. And then I put up here FMP goals and objectives. That's been discussed sometimes over the last few meetings. That last bullet, goals and objectives, would require an amendment. Everything else I've talked about could be done through an addendum. So a couple action timelines, possible timelines. If the board were to initiate an addendum at this meeting, the PDT would work to bring a draft for public comment in August. Following approval, hearings would be held during the fall, and then final action could occur in October of this year. If an amendment were initiated today, similar timeline in the beginning, first with a PID in August, hearings in the fall, and then at the annual meeting, the board would task the PDT to develop a draft based on that comment received. In February, the board would see a draft for public comment, and then following approval of that, we would have hearings on the draft in the fall of 2020. Actually, that's the spring of 2020, sorry. And then final action would occur this time next year. It's important to consider any back and forth between the development team, the technical committee, and this board may delay these timelines, so keeping those implementation dates and targets in your mind as we go through this would be helpful. Other than that, that's just a couple slides to sort of set the stage, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, to further set the stage, we have a decision tree here. The first point is amendment addendum. I've talked to many of you, and I know your opinion, so as soon as we can get a motion to go in that direction would be good. And then we can flesh things out. Rob, and then Mike, and then John.
So I'll just take a minute or two, Mr. Chair. Thank you. And actually, Max, you did a great job helping out on some of these issues we've been talking about, as did Nicole. So I think that we now know there was an example, and there was an example that was provided by the technical committee, and that's what was, in front of us today to talk about a little bit. We also know that we have conservation equivalency, and I think that I will propose that we provide today an amendment for later, much later, maybe after the dust settles on our addendum. So it's crucial that we start on an addendum. You probably have seen the information from Virginia, Massachusetts, and Connecticut imploring quick action, and lots of other things as well. You also have seen from Commissioner Bowman a letter saying that we were proposing emergency action in order to eliminate the spring trophy seasons, which have been in Virginia since 1995. And in fact, our commission in Virginia did just that through an emergency. I can't answer all the questions about these dead discards. For some reason in Virginia, that's not a problem in the recreational fishery. We're 3.8% of the total coast for dead discards. And it's always been that way since the fishery reopened in 1990. The recreational fishery does not have a lot of dead discards, usually ranking 7th or 8th. But where are the spawners? Where are the spawning stock? Where are the large fish? That's what Virginia's interested in right now. So I do want to note that we do have a commercial fishery as well, and like Maryland, it's an ITQ fishery. That makes things a little bit different than the recreational side. You can't just put in a size limit and walk away. You have to have the right mesh sizes. So I'm hoping that when we come up with conservation equivalency plans for the technical committee, that we can certainly be looking at mesh sizes in companionship with size limits, and we can have The big currency in Virginia is to try to curtail the number of large fish that are taken, regardless of where they're taken, because this is a spawning area and it's very important. One example just to give you is that we are seriously considering having a single tag per individual for one trophy fish for the entire recreational season. And that's a big step forward. And really, when you think about it, that's 36 inches, which is commonly a 10-year-old fish more often than not. What is the need for harvest of more than one? So with that, I would like to initiate an addendum and move that we do start on that today. And then I know there'll be several comments about how that goes forward, what steps need to be undertaken. Max has already outlined. And so I guess that it's a very simple motion, because I think, in a way, the technical committee is going to be seeing a variety of information from the states, from the jurisdictions, as to how they would meet the reduction. And I think it's going to be difficult today to wrap all those in, although you started, Max, with the size, season, and bag. Mesh size is there, establishing just finite maximum sizes will be there as well. So that's really just the start, Mr. Chair. And I'm welcome to someone seconding my motion to initiate an addendum to achieve the target fishing mortality rate or lower within 1 year through this addendum process.
We have a motion. Do we? A motion. Do we have a second? John McMurray, second. Before we discuss that, I had Mike and John and Doug. Do you want to provide your comments first?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you asked the question, amendment or addendum. And the answer, in my opinion, is that we need to do both. I think there is certainly a need to initiate an action today. We have concerns over the 10-year decline in spawning stock that's occurred since its peak. We certainly believe those to be concerns that we need to correct. Taking the reference points out of the picture, there's a concern there. We have to do something today. There's a problem that exists, which was discussed pretty in depth back in February, and for us that problem is the dead discard issue in the recreational fishery. And I have to say that while Nicole and the technical staff produced a nice report, which was considered an example for us to use in understanding what reductions may come in the shape of through this addendum, I'm a little disappointed and slightly discouraged that we're sitting here talking about options to increase minimum size limits across the board, only knowing that it's going to exacerbate the situation that we are currently in with dead discards being as high as they are. I really hope that those examples are just examples of what things we could put forth in this addendum to try to be creative in an approach to solving a problem. We're not going to solve a problem taking the easy road and simply using the same tools we've used in the past. We've done it. We did it in Addendum 4. We've done it with other species that we manage, summer flounder, for instance. Increasing minimum size limits across the board isn't going to work, in my opinion. And so therefore, I support the action to move forward today with an addendum. I hope we can have a more thorough discussion about elements of the addendum that could be developed over the summer to take into consideration the problem that exists, and let's try to solve a problem rather than on paper just putting numbers down so that we can walk away thinking that we've accomplished something. And lastly, what I'll say is that I think an amendment is absolutely necessary. I don't believe that a parallel track amendment at this time, given the ambitious timeline that Max put forth just in the addendum itself, is appropriate. There's only one Max. He can't work on two things at the same time and expect to get them both done. So, I do have an interest, Mr. Chairman, when we finalize the discussion on the addendum today. I do have a motion prepared for the initiation of an amendment, but that amendment would be initiated and would begin upon completion of this addendum later this year. Thank you.
John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I just had a simple question about the timeline that kind of gets to what Mike was just asking. I agree with Mike, we need an amendment as well as an addendum, but Max, was that timeline showing doing both concurrently or either or when you said it looked like either one would be done in a certain time?
Yeah, I was highlighting two possible routes if those documents were initiated today. As Mike just pointed out, it'd be difficult to work on both simultaneously. You know, more effort would be put into one and the other would be put on hold probably. So if both were initiated today, they likely wouldn't follow the timeline that I put up on the screen.
Doug.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with what has been already stated by my colleagues to the south. I think we need to initiate an addendum today and follow it up with an amendment, full-scale amendment to look at a variety of issues that have been we need to look at. But I think our plan right now specifically calls for us to take action to reduce to the target. I had a similar motion to Rob's with an additional wording to with specific tasks of the PDT to try and give them guidance in developing this addendum. And I can either take that up as I could make a substitute motion, or we could, which would give a fuller instructions to the PDT on what the board would do, or we could take this up and approve it, or and then I could add the tasking afterwards. And which would you feel would be the smoother, to either substitute right now or to take this motion up right now and then have a second motion?
I think, Doug, we should go with the substitute motion.
Okay, thank you. If you, I've given that to staff here, and as soon as that substitute comes up. Okay, I move to substitute to initiate an addendum to address overfishing status of striped bass and implement measures to reduce F back to the F target. Task the PDT to develop options that would reduce F to the target that would include a minimum fish size for the coast and a minimum fish size for the Chesapeake Bay, a slot limit that would prohibit harvest of fish over 40 inches, mandatory use of circle hooks when fishing with bait coastwide to reduce discard mortality, a provision that states could use seasonal closures in conservational equivalency proposals, and apply needed reductions equally to both the commercial and recreational sectors. And if I get a second, I'll be glad to, I'd like to provide rationale for all of these charges.
Is there a second? Justin.
So I'm using the minimum fish sizes as something to begin with, as a concept that we could task the technical committee with doing. They've already done some of that work. As far as a slot limit, I'm looking at trying to protect some of the larger spawning fish at this point. I have no idea what that's going to do to the minimum size of that, but I'd let the technical committee come up with that. I am very concerned about the amount of discard mortality, and I think it behooves this board as we move forward to try and address this with circle hooks. To be honest with you, I've never been a big fan of mandatory circle hooks because of the enforceability problem, but after I saw the results of what happened in Chesapeake Bay in Maryland when they implemented mandatory circle hooks and they got a 95% compliance, I felt that even though it's going to still be difficult to enforce, clearly the vast majority of people are willing to follow those rules and trying to put conservation measures on reducing discard mortality. A note about the statement I have here, a provision for states to use seasonal closures and conservation equivalency proposals. That's already in the plan. We don't have to put that in there, but I put that forward as another possibility for states to reduce discard mortality if you were to choose to, in some of the states where there are bay temperatures and the temperatures get warmer and the discard mortality is higher, that you could put your closures during the summer. But clearly, under conservation equivalency, we have a lot of other options that states can bring forward as far as measures that would be conservational equivalent. It's not, I want to make it clear that this is not limiting conservational equivalency only till seasonal closures. You could use net sizes, you could do a variety of things. And just to clarify, I wanted an option that would apply needed reductions equally to both commercial and recreational sectors. I certainly would not be opposed to another option that might consider just applying it to these measures to recreational fisheries if somebody wanted to put an additional task on the PDT. But from my standpoint, I feel that the commercial sector should take some portion of some measures to try and get us back to the target. So thank you very much, and that's my motion.
Thank you, Doug. There's a lot of elements there, and clearly this is not going to be a quick discussion, and it's 12:30, and right after Rob has his piece, we will break for lunch so we can all come back with full bellies and wise minds and work on this. Rob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Doug. I think it's a good motion. You can talk later on about his last point, about Doug's last point, but he did add the conservation equivalency in there, which is always there with the ASMFC, but it's good to know that, we'll have that looked at carefully by the technical committee. The slot limit over 40, Virginia would not be interested in having a fish that size in a slot limit, but nonetheless, that might be important somewhere else, but not in Virginia. Circle hooks are something we've already started to introduce to our advisory committee. Matter of fact, we've met 3 times. So I think all in all, Doug has crafted a good motion. It's going to take a little more talk after lunch, but I appreciate the motion.
Mike.
Just a quick question.
You're between us and lunch.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to keep you. Just a really quick question so I can think about this as I'm trying to eat today. So would it be the intent that each one of these, as guidance, would have, like, let's pick the circle hook example. So would the document have a status quo and a mandatory use of circle hooks? Or is the intent that all of this applies together and that everything would be initiated at once? Because I'm thinking that, as Doug mentioned, I certainly would like to amend the last bullet and have another alternative added or another option added to that set. But if we take each one of these as an independent set, I just wonder if we're going to be deciding at the end of the day either status quo, mandatory circle hooks, if we apply both to commercial, recreational, or maybe we just do recreational. Just trying to get a sense as to what you're thinking about how this is going to structure to get my act together over lunch. Thanks.
Okay. I see it as a pick and choose menu, but I'll let the maker of the motion comment on that.
Yeah, my intent here was for the PDT to develop options that the board, they'd bring back to the board for consideration for inclusion in the addendum, and that we eventually, when we're making final decision here, we're going to have come up with a suite that we choose that will accomplish that 17% reduction. It's going to, whatever it's going to take to get us back to the target.
Mike, so I also need to mull this over a little bit, but just looking at the first two bullets, for example, I see those kind of falling under the same issue, right? In a draft addendum, status quo, and then option A would be a minimum sizes, option B would be a slot sizes, things like that. But again, the PDT needs to do some work to flush out how this would look in an addendum. Same with the circle hooks. Might be a second issue, status quo versus mandatory circle hooks. So to your point, still flushing this out in my own mind. Thanks.
Okay, if we could all be back at our desks 1:30 sharp. We only have an hour to get this out the door.
If everyone could take their seats, please, we'll get started in about a minute. Thank you. Stop talking.
Could you find your seats, please? Thank you. That got quiet amazingly fast. So you've all mulled over these options. At this point, the TC has told us that they need some flesh on the bones. They need some numbers associated with these. And there's a few ways to approach it, and we're trying to figure out the easiest way. But I think the first thing we want to look at is the last one, because all analyses on the rec side, which is the rest of them, will be dependent on which way we go with that. And we either do it friendly amendment or we so a motion to hang on just a second.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think the first bit of guidance that might be helpful is there's been a lot of talk about how to apply these reductions to the commercial and recreational sector. So we have up here on the board apply them equally to both sectors. If the board wants to see another way of doing that, more applied to the recreational than the commercial, that's something we want to tease out first, because that's going to sort of duplicate or triple the types of options that are up on the screen already. So I think that's what the chairman was getting at.
Mike, and then Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I won't go back through all the comments that I made earlier in regards to the concern that we have with the stock and the problems that we see existing in the stock. And I want to remind everybody that we're not deciding today on whether or not reductions are going to be applied to both commercial and recreational fishermen. We're deciding today we're trying to develop a range of alternatives to go out to the public to get feedback as to how those reductions would apply. I see this as an opportunity to get that feedback only if we are to add something to the last bullet that sets a second set of options, which would be for the recreational fishery only, essentially excluding the commercial fishery from necessary reductions. And my intent there to add something like that or add language to this motion is we're not saying that anyone's to blame. Recreational fishermen as well as commercial fishermen have complied with and participated in the fisheries that we developed through our own state process through Addendum 4 and Conservation Equivalency Program. So there is no blame being associated with any one particular individual or individual sector. But I do think in order to have the conversation based on the level of removals being taken by the recreational fishery compared with the commercial fishery, and just that sheer magnitude in itself has opened the door for this conversation. And the only way to truly have it is to have some additional language on this bullet. Mr. Chairman, you said we could maybe do this through friendly. I'm happy to suggest language, but I also have a motion if we want to do it by motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Would the makers of the motion consider amending to provide some range of options of commercial involvement in the reduction?
From my standpoint, I would not object to there being another option to that effect.
Justin?
Justin's okay.
Then I think, and keeping in mind this is to go out to public hearing, no decisions being made, and it sounds like we can make that as a friendly motion.
I have language if you want me to just to read it.
Yeah, let's see what they figure out down the end here. Doug, Justin, is that fine?
Just to clarify, it would be a suite of options where reductions are applied equally, and then a separate suite of options where the reductions were only applied to the recreational sector. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's how I would intend it to be, and it's partially based on the question that I asked Nicole earlier regarding an analysis. If you were to take that analysis that was done in the report by the technical committee and now apply that analysis throughout just the recreational sector, you're going to come up with different levels of reductions that will be necessary. And I think this is the way that you get at it. So you almost have two columns for each option as you go forward, one with rec and commercial together and one with recreational only. Thanks.
Justin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For clarification, based on what Mike is saying, would that mean that we're setting up a binary choice where the two options in the document would either be commercial takes no reduction or commercial takes an equal reduction, and there wouldn't be a possibility of doing something in the middle after it comes back from public comment?
I will have to take advice. I would guess because we went to public hearing with the extremes that we could pick something in the middle.
Unless you specify you cannot.
That would be what I said is wrong. Or set.
I think if you said on the record today that you were only taking one or the other, then that could apply. But if you just leave it, and you'd have to write that into the document, you could say that the board would not be able to choose an option in between. But otherwise, normally, you can go anywhere from one end of the spectrum to the other.
All right. I think this accomplishes what we're trying to do then. Doug?
I would just point out that I believe that if we were to pick something in the middle at final decision, you wouldn't know what your percentage reduction, what any of these measures would be when you're making that decision.
You're completely correct, Doug. So we either go with 0 or 100, or we throw in another option at this point and give the TC yet another avenue to analyze. Jim, did I?
Thanks, Chairman. And I just want to echo Mike's comments. I think that a lot of us have gone through is that with all the suggestions we've had since the February meeting, and there's many of them that we've had at our council meeting in New York, we don't want to prejudge this. We want to come up with a bunch of options that when we come back in August and we put this out on the street, that we're going to have a suite of things to look at that consider all different alternatives. And everybody wants to get this done quickly, and if we don't include things now, we could end up, delaying this even further. So I clearly want to see the numbers from this stuff, because a lot of it is more concept at this point. And once we get numbers wrapped around some of these options, I think it'll maybe guide our final selection more efficiently. Thanks.
John?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to be clear that what this does is provides us analysis of what the effects are going to be, whether we go across the board reductions or just on the recreational side. And I'm assuming that's going to prove to be quite a bit more impactful to the recreational side than what we're looking at now. And that's probably going to play out at the public hearing side of things. But am I correct in that assumption? I mean, we're not looking to make a decision here. We're just looking to get the analysis, see what it looks like, to provide context for a future decision.
Yes, this is all guidance to develop alternative measures to put into a draft to eventually go out to public comment.
Tom Foti.
I got a question first. To ask, when is the 2018 catch figures going to be finalized? Is it May?
That's MRIP. May, June.
Yeah.
Yeah, commercial harvest will come in the June 15 compliance report. So.
But the recreational will be before that.
Hopefully.
Okay, so here's what I'm getting at. I just want to say one statement on it. The last time we did the reduction was supposed to be 25% equally in both the commercial and the recreational sector. But a lot of states, by the way they implemented the regulations, was a 32% reduction or 33% reduction, 34% reduction on the recreational sector, and only a 25% reduction on the commercial sector, because that was a set in line. But by the time they go into one fish or a bigger fish and one fish, it wound up being a bigger reduction. But on the other point, what I'm trying to say is that if we're going to have the final figures, and 2018 is a 25% reduction, I would like to basically have that included in the projections. I mean, why are we not using the best information that we have available to basically do that? Because we've done this before. And I've also been down this road before, as you made me change my slot limit years ago, and when I basically go for a regulation, and 4 years down the road, 3 years, we find out we were not in the baddest shape as we thought we were, and it basically winds up being, especially, I think there's a lot more reasons why we saw a 25% reduction in 2018, if that's the number, and I think that's going to continue because of the drop-off of anglers going out and the reduction of trips again. So I really would think that's important, so we can justify, because if people see we have a 25% reduction when we need a 17, if we average it out between 16, 17, and 18, it'll smooth it out some, and we should have an idea with the 18. So I'm asking to include that when we do it, at least one option to show what those numbers are. Because we have the numbers, it's best on the best science available at the time that we're making our decision, and we should be making it with the best available science that's there. And that's what I'm asking for. Because we're not going to public hearings till later after that.
I don't know if there was a question in there, but are we talking about the reference year of these analyses and whether it should be 2017, 2018, or an average across the most recent 3 years, something like that?
I'm asking a way of how to handle the 2000. I just don't want to make it 2018 figures because it might be lopsided. But if you average it with the 2016, 2017, and 2018, it shows the trend for over 3 years. And it might not be a 25% reduction, but it'd be something different than it is right now at at 17. So less than a 17% reduction. It might be less. I want to look at the figures as it's the best available science that we have.
So thanks for teeing that up, because I think that's still a missing piece of this motion here is what the reference year is when we say reduce F back to the target by what time, what year, and also what that reference would be.
And that's what I'm suggesting is, do we do an average of 16, 17, 18 to get what the 3 years are showing, not just use 117. And I think since we have the science for all 3 of those years, let's use all 3 of those years.
Doug.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but when you did the example analysis, you did an example with using the 2017 as a terminal year, and then you did a 3-year average of, I forget which 3 years, and it came out to be almost exactly the same % reduction. Am I incorrect? I thought I saw that in the analysis.
So that was our assumption that we made for 2019. We did one scenario where 2019 equaled 2018 preliminary landings, and then we did another scenario where 2019 equaled the 3-year average.
Follow up on that, Mike?
Go ahead, Tom.
But did you use proxies in that numbers, or was it the complete 2018 catch? You said it was the preliminary numbers, so where was the preliminary numbers coming from? And it's the same preliminary numbers that you have now that we will have in the final numbers?
The numbers that we used are the numbers we currently have, which are just preliminary estimates.
Eric, so if we could concentrate on the changes we just made, the commercial allocation, so we can move past that one and then move on to the other items. Eric? Is this not concerning that?
Well, it's just an indication of effort in both commercial and recreational sectors. Is that in bounds, Mr. Chairman, or not? I'll make it quick.
Sure.
Okay, so I appreciate Mr. Luisi's motion, but my position is about what we know and what we don't know. What we know is the commercial fishery for striped bass is, we know reasonably well what the potential effort is on any given year, because as far as Rhode Island goes, you can't just go out and get a license. I don't know about the rest of the states, but I'm pretty sure it's limited entry up and down the coast. So that's one universe that is reasonably finite, and that effort can be defined. But when it comes to the recreational sector, if the number of saltwater recreational licenses is a metric for potential effort, those numbers are staggering. I know in Rhode Island, when the license came out, the first year it came out, we had 20,000 recreational licenses issued. The next year, there was over 30,000. Virginia is in the same position, only the numbers are much bigger in Virginia. And the rest of the states I couldn't find and figure it out, or else I'd have them for every one of you, but I couldn't do it. So my position is it's better to isolate the commercial sector because of the potential effort versus the recreational sector for the exponential increase at any given moment for that effort. So thank you. If that's some data you can look at, I don't know if that's a question for you.
Ray.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Eric, we still have, people can get endorsements. We don't have limited entry in Massachusetts. But getting back to Mike's supply needed reductions to the recreational sector only, what's the time frame on this? After the technical team runs all the scenarios, when will we be seeing this again? At the summer meeting or at the annual meeting?
We will, I think I know this one. We'll be seeing it the summer. We'll finalize it for public hearing. We'll go out to public hearing. We'll come back in October and vote.
Thank you.
Unless you guys get really carried away with all of the options that you want to see here, this is a reasonable set of options, but just keep that in mind as you add to this list.
Adam. Kowalski.
My comment did not pertain to the last two current bullet points, so would you like me to hold off?
No, go ahead.
I don't think we could reasonably request a technical analysis of this, but an item I would like to see included in the document would be something that references the potential for disproportionate impacts to the different recreational users of the resource. Unlike a lot of the recreational fisheries this commission manages across other boards, this fishery has two very distinct user groups: those who target the fish with the intent to harvest, and those that target the fish with the intent to release. And we've had conversation about the concerns about release mortality. We've heard the concerns here this morning about simply increasing the size is probably not a preferred way to proceed based on what we know about this fishery and many of our individual experiences with other recreational fisheries management in recent years. So when I look at some of these options here, increasing a minimum fish size or having a slot limit that prohibits harvest, there's potentially an entire user group out there, in industry in fact, that this will have zero impact on. Zero. And I think that's a disproportionate impact that this management action could have, and I'd at least like to see that referenced in the document. Anything that can be put forward about it, any thoughts about it by the PDT for our consideration when we come back here to consider sending this document out for public comment in the summer, I think it's very, very important. So any thoughts other people have as we go around the table here, but my request would just to be to see that included and referenced in the document as a concern.
Do you have that, Max? Okay. Steve Bowman?
Mr. Chair, my comments would be a little bit more simplistic. I'm adamantly opposed, in all due respect to my colleague from Maryland, where you got to add a clarifier which basically singles out a specific user group. The law of the Commonwealth of Virginia prohibits specifically the consideration of one user group over another. I know what we're trying to get at, but if we leave from here today with that statement on there, you can rest assured from a constituency perspective, maybe not some, but primarily from a lot of us, if you leave that statement on there, it's going to be read as if that's the direction that we're going. And I have some significant heartburn with the addition of that specific statement. In addition, there has been, I think, a false presumption, and I know it's hard to keep up with, but from a law enforcement background, we're considering the fact that in the commercial sector, the numbers are what they are. Now, I realize the recreational sector, they are what they are as well. But in the commercial sector, there's a heck of a lot more of product lost than's being accounted for. And I will mention one specific investigation where we know, and one would say, well, why don't you take care of it? Because there's a reason that persons are overly or fishing well over the quota based on the system that we have in place in Virginia, which we'll be looking at. So I want to make sure everybody keeps in mind that it's not as clean as it looks as far as on paper is concerned, as far as the commercial sector is concerned. And I really do believe if we could do something to massage the next to the last item, we would be a lot better off. Because if you leave here, I know what the constituency is going to think. They're going to think, aha, there they go. What they're doing basically is going to single out the recreational sector for application to these measures. So with that, I thank you for your time.
Thank you. Tom Foti.
I agree with Steve, and it's going to be a bad message to send out. But the other thing I want to follow up is on what Adam was saying. You know, I'm reading a blog one day from one of my friends, and they talk about the fact that they went out and caught and released 203 fish in an afternoon of fishing, and they were using bloodworms. Now, nowhere in the article did they put on the blog that not only they caught 203 fish, but they basically killed 16 fish through hook and release mortality. And that's what I'm concerned about. When we start looking at this, people are going to fish for striped bass. We always knew it was going to be a higher mortality when we opened the fishery up in '92, because we knew at that time what happened over the years. I wasn't going to go into this. Is the history of went on with regulations. When you push people with closed seasons on summer flounder and black sea bass, remember, in 1995, we had no closed seasons on black sea bass, scub. We didn't have any bag limits, as a matter of fact, and summer flounder was 10 fish at 14 inches. It was coast-wide, and that was the regulations, and no closed season. And then we started inching. By the time we got to 2001 and the striped bass had all gotten big from the years we protected them, all of a sudden the guys that didn't want to fish for striped bass because they said they weren't good to eat, they wanted to catch summer flounder, black sea bass, and other species, now turned their attention to striped bass. And because it ain't like the old days when I was fishing in the 60s and 70s and crawled on jetties and lost my 2 front teeth on top by falling on the rocks, because it was a lot different. You were skinning eels to use eel skins and everything else. Now to become a striped bass fisherman, all you had to do was throw a hook in a bunker and you were king. You could catch a 50-pounder. And so it introduced a lot more people into striped bass fishing. And again, for food, because you couldn't catch other species. If we take off some, now this is what we do. We always do single species management, and we're talking about ecosystem. We should look at the impacts when you do this on striped bass. What are the impacts going to be on black sea bass? What are the impacts going to be on summer flounder? Because you start closing those seasons, then you're directing people to go into other fisheries. And that's what's happened over the last 15 years. We rejected, because again, 15, 20 years ago, the guys that were fishing summer flounder would sooner fish summer flounder. They didn't want to fish for striped bass because they wanted those fish to take home to eat. Same thing with black sea bass. And we pushed them to now become striped bass fishermen. So we redirected their behavior. And that's the new world we're facing now, is people that not only want to do largely catch and release, but there is another sector that basically harvests. And a lot of our businesses that we have in our states, both from the recreational sector, the charter boats, the party boats, the tackle stores, and depends on those both individual groups functioning in unison. And when you start eliminating one of those, you wind up with a collapse of businesses up and down the coast. So my job is to make sure first is the fishery sustainable. And if we did a 25% reduction last year, and if, they said, as they said in the statement earlier, we might not have to do anything. If we're going to do something, make sure we include that year in there to see what we actually have to do, and then we make sure we do it equally so everybody takes an equal hit if we're going to do that.
Thank you, Tom. Sarah, and we are running out of time. We need to get to brass tacks very quickly here. Sarah.
I'll try to be brief and concise in my comments. I think that the last bullet point could in effect be radioactive in Massachusetts. There's been a push for a number of years to make striped bass give a game fish status in the Commonwealth. We have, I think, a well-managed both commercial and recreational fishery. I think that as we look at management measures, we should look at both commercial and the recreational sectors. I think the word equally is where we're getting hung up. As maybe each sector doesn't need to take the quote-unquote same hit. Maybe what we're really looking at is applying management measures to both commercial and rec sectors in an equitable manner. It doesn't mean that if we're asking for a 15% or 25% reduction in one sector, it's got to be 25% in the other. I mean, we look at what the mortality rate is in each. We have to look at something that's an equitable solution, and maybe it's not an equal solution.
Richie.
Concerned that we're not gaining and running out of time. So I see two alternatives to get this thing going. Either to call a question on this, and then if anybody wants to change it, they make a motion, or limit debate. So I would ask for your choice, Mr. Chair, and I'd be willing to make either motion.
All right, let me go a third tact. I think we can move this along. This one needed to be a friendly amendment. The rest just need advice for the TC. If people have comments on the other ones, and I'll ask the TC what they need also. So I think we can move along faster. There were comments over here. So at this, procedurally, we will vote, when we're done amending this to our liking, we will vote for this versus the original simple motion made by Rob O'Reilly. And this, if this wins, that's substitutes for that motion. Okay.
Can I just pitch some questions?
Sure.
So to try to help move this along, I have a couple questions, and we can start from the top of the motion, maybe work our way down. Some questions for the board to provide some clear direction here. So the first I have is talking about by what year we would implement, or by what year we would bring F back to target. Would that be 2020? It's asking for bringing to target within 1 year. Also, let's see, trying to work my way down here. Talking about the quota, how we would apply reductions to the commercial sector, would that just be via quota reductions, or are we talking about exploring size limits or bag limits for the commercial sector? Direction on that would be helpful. Otherwise, I see the technical committee and PDT just showing quota cuts. Also a reference year. So maybe let's just start with those three. Reference year, when we would achieve F target, and when we talk about reductions to the commercial sector, are we just talking about quota?
Doug.
So my intent with this, and I'm sorry if I didn't put 2020 in, is that it has to be in place by 2020. And the reason I didn't put it in the motion was because within Amendment 6, it requires within 1 year. So to me, it was already implicit that that was our direction. But if you want to have a modification to it, we can do that. My concept with the next to last bullet, when we were talking about commercial reductions, it was to take a 17% reduction in the quota, but how, a state reduces that quota is up to them. If they want to come in with a conservation equivalency, that's up to them. But that was what I was looking at, was a 17% reduction. And as far as the base year, our terminal year is 2017 in the assessment. So my intent was that we'd be basing it off of 2017, unless the technical committee felt that there would be a more appropriate year or range of years to use in this analysis.
Thank you. So you've addressed all three questions. Could I ask the TC what's the default that you'll be using for the analysis?
I think that's good guidance. And if the TC has a better recommendation for a reference year, that'll come out in the next step. So I guess also just for clarification, but the first 4 bullets there, we're assuming that those all apply to the recreational sector, and that the commercial sector is not involved with those first four bullets. Seeing nod from Mr. Grout, thank you.
Andy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My arm is so tired. So I wanted to move back above the bullets, and I've been trying to get my hand up sooner so that I could get there sooner. I guess my question, I'm confused about why we have gone to the lowest possible common denominator, lowest possible denominator to start. And with respect to Doug, who I value his opinion greatly, we have a threshold and we have a target. We have instantly agreed that we're going to shoot for the lowest possible thing on the target here. We're going to go for the target. We're going to task the TC to look at alternatives for all these bullet items, but we have limited ourselves to only going as far as the target. The TC told us that the example we were given was a 50% chance of a 17% reduction in mortality. And if I went to the doctor and I was going to have surgery and he said, you have a 50% chance of dying, I would say, I'm going to go to another doctor and find one that'll give me an 80% chance of surviving. So in looking at this situation, I'm wondering, can we move back up to the body of this, accepting that the bullets have been worked over pretty well, and increase that either from target to threshold or somewhere between target and threshold, so that if we miss on our 50% shot, we don't come up short after doing all this work and all this planning. And thanks for Doug's consideration and for the time to speak.
Doug?
The reason I went specifically to the target is because that's what's called for in Amendment 6. It says this is what we need to do within 1 year, come back to the target. So I didn't see that we had at this point any other option until we start looking at the amendment that has been discussed here in the future. Maybe that's something that we will consider in the future. But right now we're operating under Amendment 6, and we don't have the option to be looking at the threshold.
Jay, Mac, Naveen.
So just on this topic to Commissioner Shields, the target is the more conservative of the two. With fisher mortality, you want the lower number. So I think you're maybe reversing target and threshold. So that was just clarification. The other point is the probability. That's something we need to specify, I believe, and I will start the volley at suggesting 50% is a good probability, and I think people often mischaracterize. This isn't a binary live or die situation. This is a continuous situation, and so when you say 50%, what you're saying is your highest probability is being at that target, and then the distribution decreases as you get away from it. So you're still really probable of being somewhere around that target. If you think of like a bell curve, the middle of the bell curve would be your target, and you can kind of slide to either side depending on the uncertainty. And so I think that is a fair place to start, and so I'll offer that we should give that guidance to the PDT or the technical committee, a 50% probability of achieving the F target.
Okay, that's guidance to the TC. We don't need to amend this at all for that. So, Megan Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to join the Massachusetts and Virginia commissioners in our discomfort with that last bullet. I realize that this is for a range of alternatives, and we're exploring analysis right now, but just want to flag that as a source of heartburn for Maine moving forward.
Thank you. John McMurray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to contribute to the F target confusion here, I think I want to go back to the question that I asked during the first presentation on the stock assessment or on the TC report. So we're looking to reduce F to F target, but I still did not get clarification. And to Andy's point about half measures and 50% probabilities, where is the calculation of what's going to get us to SSB target? I think that needs to be part of this document, because if it's not, we're going to get accused of half measures and not taking enough steps to get us back to where we should be.
Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To John's point, I mentioned earlier that I don't think that we're solving anything. I mean, this is a short-term. We need to take action short-term here, but I think where we solve some problems is for the long-term outlook. I have prepared a motion to initiate an amendment after we take this issue up, and I have the rebuilding of the biomass as one of the functions in that amendment discussion. And I think, you know, we've talked. The timeline here is ambitious. we can't have any hiccups. There can't be any questions going, you know, as we move forward. We've got to be clean and smooth in all of this. And I think the more we add into this document, the more complicated it's going to get, and the less likely we're going to have it in place by 2020 as a caution. But I just wanted to put that back out there, that I do have an intent to for a motion on an amendment after we take up this issue. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to be clear, though, that the trigger number 2 in Amendment 6 requires us not only to address overfishing, but to rebuild the stock. And the feedback that I got from staff is that maybe F-Target does do that. If it does, I'd like to see that it does. And if it doesn't, I'd like to see what would. And I don't think that's unreasonable to ask that of the TC for this document.
Nicole.
So it would be completely reasonable to task the TC with doing a projection that shows you at what point in the projection SSB comes back up to the target. We could do that. If the board tasked us to do that, we can certainly do that.
Consider yourself tasked. I'm not sure I have that power, but you guys can tell me otherwise. Justin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the risk of not following Katie's advice to task the technical committee folks with coming up with too many options, I would like to expand a little bit upon the slot limit options that are going to be looked at. In particular, I'd be interested in seeing slot limit options with a 28 or a 32-inch minimum size, and then figuring out what the accompanying upper size limit would need to be to achieve the necessary reductions. I feel pretty strongly that slot limits are something we should really be thinking about. I've heard a lot of support from the public for it. I'm concerned about, you know, like has been mentioned many times around the table today, the potential increase in recreational discards that will come with a higher minimum length limit. And as Adam alluded to earlier, I have heard from some of my constituents in the party charter industry, in certain areas of Long Island Sound, they have trouble accessing fish larger than 28 to 32 inches. So by having a slot limit, we would still allow access to abundant small fish for some folks that still do rely on harvest for their business or because that's what they're interested in out of the fishery, while still potentially, you know, providing the conservation we need, and also encouraging folks to put those bigger fish back in the water, which I think we all know is really important for the productivity of the stock. So if it's possible, I'd like to see those options looked at under slot limits, not just a slot limit with an upper end of 40, but with a lower end of 28 or 32, and where that gets us.
Okay, I regard that as advice to the TC, and short of anyone with vehement objections, we'll move that forward. I hesitate. Are there any more amendments that people would entertain here? Steve Bowman.
Mr. Chairman, just very, very quickly, the Commonwealth of Virginia is prepared to support this motion with the amendment to the next to last bullet, which changes, as Sarah had indicated, from equally to equitably, and eliminating the last line.
I think the PDT is going to have trouble with equitable, of what that means.
Okay, what would the PDT not have a problem with?
They need specific numbers, as in the commercial fishery will not have a reduction. They'll have 50% of that 17. They'll have 100% of that 17.
Okay, I'll yield to Ms. McPeak, who's had her hand.
Sarah Peak.
It's not going to be helpful because it goes in the other direction. I was saying if we just take out the word equally, apply needed reductions to both commercial and recreational sectors, and then can you show us a menu of options? And I guess beyond this, what are we doing in terms of tying the hands of our state managers to determine where you have both a commercial and a recreational sector to understand state by state how big the rec sector is versus the commercial? And I'm struggling with how we can take a one-size-fits-all approach here where there may be not so nuanced differences state to state relative to the size of the commercial harvest versus the rec sector. Maybe I'm missing something.
Tony has a comment.
Okay, and my understanding, historically this board has, when we take a 17% cut, everyone takes it. And there's been some consideration that maybe because commercial has been static, rec has grown, that it's time to look at it in a different way. That would be the option on the board.
Thank you for the explanation.
I'll just add, Sarah, that any state can use conservation equivalency proposals to address something that they feel as though they want to treat their state's fishery in a more unique way. And therefore you can move forward with changing your percentages of how you're going to address the reduction that your state takes, as long as it equals the total amount that your state would have taken. And it's approved by the board.
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback off of what Tony was just saying about conservation equivalency. I see seasonal closures could be part of a conservation equivalency proposal, and I just want to, point out that if the intent is to have conservation equivalency as part of the addendum development process, that's an added step in the timeline. And to keep that in mind, there would be states would have to do their homework, bring it back to the technical committee for review in order to build those alternatives into the draft document. How it worked out with Addendum 4, for example, is the addendum went forward without conservation equivalency, and that was actually done after the addendum was implemented. So to stick to the timeline that I showed, conservation equivalency would happen as a second step, as a second process after the addendum was completed.
Tom.
I cannot support this with the last bullet in, so I'll make a motion that we remove the last bullet and handle that in the amendment, not in the addendum, because that's the one that's going to be the lightning rod we go out to. So I make a motion that we remove the last bullet that's been put up there, apply needed reductions to the recreational sector only.
Is there a second to that motion? Yes, Dennis Abbott.
We had an original motion and we have an amended motion. I think that it's a requirement that we vote on the amendment first. We can't keep amending the amendment.
Doug, you got some help
As
here.
you indicated, this is a substitute. You said that the best thing would just be a substitute motion. And as you know, with Robert's Rules of Order, we need to amend both the substitute motion and make any amendments to the underlying motion. And then once all the amendments are done, then we approve, we vote on the substitute motion. And if it fails, if it is approved, then that becomes the main motion. If it fails, the underlying motion becomes the main motion. So amendments, at least by Robert's rules, are in fact, we suggest that you get all the amendments in place until you've got your substitute and your main motion exactly the way you want it.
Is there a second to this motion? Andy Shields. Discussion. I'll call the question. The motion.
Can we caucus?
Yes, caucus. The motion is to amend to delete apply needed reductions to the recreational sector only from the substituted motion.
Two minutes.
2 minutes, please.
Chairman Armstrong.
Please have your seats, please, so we can call the question. All right. In regards to the motion on the board by Mr. Foti, all in favor, raise your hand.
Keep them up.
Okay. All against, raise your hand. Any null? Abstentions? The motion passes 9-5, 2 abstentions. Going back to the main motion, which is a substitute motion. Do we need to caucus? All affirmative, raise your hand. I'm sorry.
Can't be it.
Okay. We will be voting on the amended substitute motion. Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to amend this motion to remove, in the last bullet, I'm doing this on the fly, so excuse me, remove the word equally and replace it with equitably based on harvest.
Is there a second? Steve Train. Would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, you know, the commercial fishery has been operating under a quota, and they've not exceeded that quota, at least not that I'm aware of over the past, I don't know how many years, that commercial quota has not been exceeded. So to ask the commercial fishing industry to take the same percentage reduction as the recreational fishery, and we've seen, you know, earlier today, we saw the bar graph that Tom Foti was having trouble with, showing what the harvests are. So I think it's more fair and more equitable.
Doug Grout.
I'm going to speak against this amendment because I think that for the purposes of analysis, we need to give the PDT and the technical committee a specific figure, because they don't have, from what we heard from their response there, was they need something like that because they don't know what equitably means to us. So I urge the board not to approve this, to support this, but if you want to have something like that, you need to come up with some kind of a specific percentage reductions for each entity.
Further discussion. Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand where Emerson's going with this, and I think it's something to consider in this addendum. I just wonder if we could apply some numbers, as Doug mentioned, if we were to change the language from equitably to proportionally based on total removals. So we're taking that total removal picture of dead discards and harvest by the two sectors and proportionalizing if proportionalizing is a word, we're doing something with those numbers, which is close to 90-10, and applying reductions in that capacity. I don't know if that's what your intent was, Emerson, but that could fix the problem that Doug brought up.
Yes, that was my intent. So I'll accept that as a friendly.
You will accept that as a friendly amendment. Steve Train. I'm just checking to see if the TC is clear on that charge.
Mr. Chairman, if it's okay, I'll just add to the point. I forgot to mention that we could pick a year, maybe the terminal year. That would set the proportional allotment to the sectors. That, again, to the maker and the seconder.
That's fine.
Steve Train, you okay with that?
Yes.
The makers are okay with another friendly amendment. Tom Foti.
According to the plan, there's no quota on the commercials. To the recreational, there's no split. And we have no problem when it's SCUB, when it's 17% of the recreational catches 17% of the quota. And when we start making reductions, which won't affect the overall quota, even goes, the winter SCUB fishery is not even being caught, and yet we'll put those fish reductions in equally on the recreational sector that's only catching 17% of the fishery. That's our historical way of doing business. And to start trying to do business in another way to be accommodating to one or two sectors is not going to work. And I don't want that firestorm. If you're going to do it in an amendment where we actually spell out everything and basically go through and take the time to really study this. But you try to do it under this addendum, you're going to wind up with a firestorm in the recreational community just opposing the whole amendment addendum, and so you might not get what you want for when we get up here and basically want to vote on it in October. So if you want to really get out of October, make a cleaner addendum and put it in the amendment.
All right, I'm going to move the question. We are running out of time. Do we need to caucus? 1 minute caucus. A point of clarification, this would get rid of the option to equally split it. And I don't think that's the intent of the motioners. I think you would rather add this as another option, keep equally as an option, and then have this as an option.
Yeah, I would be comfortable with that as an additional option to look at, yes. So I don't know if I need to reword my original motion, but that's fine. Steve, I don't know if you're comfortable with that or not.
It's not that I'm trying to wordsmith here, but there's a pretty specific definition of the word equal. And when you have two parties involved, but one party has a smaller interest, equal isn't fair.
Well, I think it would be 17% of the commercial quota, 17% of the rec harvest, and which would be much larger, of course. And so that would remain. This new option would bring it down to 10% reduction for commercial. Well,
I'll be satisfied with the second option, yes.
All right, we will restructure that, and let's caucus now based on as this evolves. Okay, 1 minute. Adam.
So I just need a clarification on that last comment that you just made. What does proportionally based on total removals mean? I heard you just say that that would bring the commercial reduction from 17% down to 10%.
Yeah, let me step back from that.
So I interpreted the proportionally as that instead of taking 17% reduction on the commercial side would take the proportion of the harvest times 17% as their reduction. So if their proportion of the harvest was 10%, the reduction in harvest needed was 17%. The commercial side would be reducing by 1.7%, and the recreational side was reducing by the rest. So I'd like to hear and that's a big difference between a 1.7% reduction and a 10% reduction. So I think we need to be very clear what we're adding here on the record, and I appreciate your help with that.
Yeah, let us clarify that. I misspoke on that. It's really, I believe it's multiplying 10% times the reduction, but we'll get.
Right, so it's complicated because it's percentages, but I think, so what we're doing with all of this percentages is we came up with a number of fish that you need to have. The removals in 2020 need to be about 5.9 million fish in order to reach the target. And so that's coming down from a set number. And so that's coming down from about 7 million in 2017. So what we're saying is that in this case, the way the TC, I think, would interpret this is proportionally based on total removals. If the commercial sector represents 10% of the total removals, then they're going to take 10% of that reduction necessary to get down to the 5.9 million fish. And the rest of that will go to the recreational side, will be responsible for taking the 90% of that reduction of going down to 5.9 million fish in 2020. So when we say equally, we mean everybody takes the same amount of a cut across the board. When we say proportionally based on harvest, we're saying the recreational side is going to take 90%, or is going to take their proportion of total removals out of that reduction that we need to come from 7 million down to 5.9 million fish in order to achieve the target. So versus everybody taking the same amount of the same percent cut. Does that make sense?
Well, so that would get the total cut for the commercial side would be closer to 1.7% than it would be to 10%.
Yes, it would be, yes. I can't guarantee that those numbers are exactly right because it's percentages, but yes, the idea would be it would be a much lower percentage than if that percentage is applied equally.
All right. I think we all get it. Did you caucus? I need to caucus very briefly, 30 seconds. All right, are we ready?
I just want to clarify something too. Sorry. I was informed that it might help to clarify what the technical committee interprets equally as when we talk about equal reductions. We're not talking, to make round numbers are easy to work with. Take 1 million fish. We're not talking about 500,000 fish would apply to the commercial, 500,000 to the recreational. We're talking about proportional percent reductions. So it's not the same amount of fish we're talking about. We're talking proportional reductions for the sectors. That's what equally means to us in this case.
To the motion on the board. All in the affirmative, raise your hand. Okay. Opposed? Null? Abstention? Motion passes 13 to 3. This will be added back to the motion, substitute motion. And we know where this is heading. We've seen it 10 times so far. So caucus while we're waiting, if you could. Tom?
I'm just asking for a roll call vote.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Adam Nowalski.
Did you want to address a point of order first?
Oh, I'm sorry, what was the point of order? Who had the point of order?
It was my mistake. Forget about it. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Just a clarification with the provision for circle hooks with bait coast-wide. We heard comments earlier about bloodworms, smaller fish. Is that intended to mean all states, all areas, inshore and offshore, coastwide, or did that just mean coastwide in terms of the coastal waters as we talk about the two differences in the fishery here?
Doug?
My intent was it would be an option that all states would implement, that for anybody fishing for striped bass with bait would need to have circle hooks. And again, this is just an option to go in there. I understand the potential enforcement issues behind it, but it's an option that could potentially get us to reducing the discards mortality, which is an important part of this addendum.
Sarah Peak.
A related question then, based on the response. So circle hooks for bait, what does that mean for fly fishing where there's a feather attached to the end? Would they not be required to have circle hooks?
No. Any bait, it would not be attached to a lure, or it would not need to be attached to a lure or to a fly, because that's where you have, from the studies that we've seen, is when you're using bait, whether it's chunk bait, whether it's live bait, whether it's worms, whatever. That's not artificials, no artificials. It would not apply to artificials. Does that answer the question?
It answers the question, and I'll talk to you offline, I guess, about why does it matter bait versus non-bait if we're looking to diminish the stress on the animal so that it has a greater chance of surviving when it's caught and released. I don't understand why it makes a difference whether you have bait or
I'll be glad to
lure.
talk to you offline. I've got a variety of studies that will explain why it only applies to bait.
If it's helpful, and I hope it is, we can flesh this out more. This will not be able to be analyzed by the TC. There are no data appropriate for coming up with a quantitative answer for.
Right, I think the TC would be very hesitant to use this to apply to any of the reductions, but we can look at sort of the studies and see, if we assume perfect compliance, if we, where would this be applicable is something we could look at, but I think we would be very hesitant to say this will count towards your X% reduction.
It would be a positive measure that is unquantifiable and not necessarily a bad thing. I hope that, can we move the question? Yes, Tom Foti.
You said all bait. Now, like Massachusetts is all hook and line fishery, and New York has a hook and line fishery, and they use bait on those fisheries. Are you basically directing them now that they should be using circle hooks, the same way the recreational fishermen are doing, or is it just pertaining, again, just to the recreational sector?
The original intent of this was it would just apply to the recreational sector because they're the lion's share of it, but if someone would like to offer an amendment to have it include the commercial sector, I would not oppose that, but my intent was just to have it apply to the recreational sector.
Yeah, and I think it can be done in a later meeting. Chris Bat-Savage.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I assume the Law Enforcement Committee will review this as the addendums being developed for enforceability issues, which will be challenging over a wide area. But just so the PDT is aware when they're putting this together, for North Carolina, not all of the striped bass fisheries in North Carolina are managed through the ASMFC FMP. So in our case, it would just be the coastal ocean waters that this would be applied to, not the estuarine waters. Thanks.
All right, let's vote. This is a roll call.
Tom asked for a roll call.
Oh, he did?
Yeah, he did.
Okay. To the motion, it has been requested that this is a roll call vote, and so we shall do that.
Okay, working north to south, Maine?
Yes.
New Hampshire?
Yes.
Massachusetts,
Yes.
Rhode Island,
Yes.
Connecticut,
Yes.
New York,
Yes.
New Jersey,
Yes.
Pennsylvania,
Yes.
Delaware,
Yes.
Maryland,
Yes.
District of Columbia, Potomac River Fisheries Commission,
Yes.
Virginia,
Yes.
North Carolina,
Yes.
National Marine Fisheries Service,
Yes.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Yes.
Motion carried.
The motion carries unanimously. Next order of business, Mike.
Just a reminder, Mr. Chairman, that was a substitute motion, I believe, that we'll need to now make the main motion and vote again.
That is correct. Given the previous vote, we could do this by consensus. Is there any objection to moving the substitute motion over Rob O'Reilly's original one? Seeing no objection, it passes. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know we are incredibly behind time here that we have allotted for this discussion, but I wonder if you would consider what I've mentioned a few times already today, a motion that I prepared and sent to staff, which would initiate an amendment today, initiate an amendment to the striped bass fishery management plan to address the needed consideration for change on the issues of fishery goals and objectives, empirical, biological, spatial reference points, management triggers, rebuilding biomass, and area-specific management. Work on this amendment will begin upon the completion of the previously discussed addendum to the management plan. And I'd like to make that motion. If I can get a second, I'll add quick, brief points about why I think this is the direction we should take.
Second by John Clark. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, I've made the point a few times already, so I won't restate that again. I just think that Amendment 6 has been in the works since 2003. We've seen declines over time to get us to the point where we are now. I think it's time for a comprehensive look at the plan, addressing not only the issues that are listed here, but any others that members of the board may want to add as we take this on. I don't think a parallel track with the addendum that we just started is appropriate, so we would essentially postpone any work on this until after the addendum's complete. Thanks.
Discussion. Craig Pugh.
One question to the motion. Would you accept reallocation as a discussion with this amendment?
There's a lot to any kind of reallocation. If you just wanted to, there's the commercial recreational splits, there's state-specific allocations. I think I'd want to be I would want to start with this, but that could be something that we might want to add later.
Specifically, my interest here would be to relook at the commercial end of that, not so much recreational, but the commercial end of that, in our minds, in the state of Delaware, has been that we have been allocated a disproportional amount of the quota for a number of years, well over 30 years. And it has been a bit of a chip on our shoulder for a long, long time. And these are things that need to be addressed. I see that New York wants to address this with their summer flounder, but we also have had this issue for a long time in the state of Delaware with striped bass. And we think it's time to reassess this. We're working off of 1970s catch data, and we're looking at a 2020 fish. I don't think it's too much to ask to bring this up to date. We have issues with climate change and other things that everybody would like to throw into these things, and I think it's high time that we proportionally look at these allocations in a different manner and as they apply to the coast today. I think it's important and it should be added to this. I guess I'd like to make an amendment to the motion to add the issue of commercial reallocation.
Do we have a second? Second by Eric Reed. Adam Nowalski.
So let me ask a question. I understand we're now on an amendment and we should be limiting debate to that, but I think it's relevant here with regards to our path forward. This issue of allocation has now been brought up specifically on the commercial side. With regards to the MRIP re-estimates, there's discussion about commercial recreational allocation for almost all other species. That box is being opened very soon. What is the advantage to initiating this amendment today as opposed to postponing this until after the addendum is completed, at which time, in that interim time, we could have some conversation about the allocation issues both within one sector and across sectors? Why would we need to do this today? We got it up on the board. We've got it here to digest. We've heard some other issues that we want to consider. What advantage do we gain today?
An option that the board could take here is, because this document wouldn't start work until after the addendum is done, if you all want to spend the time this week talking with each other and maybe even between now and the August meeting about the things that you would really want to include and put some thought into what you would want in an amendment, and then we could bring this back up again at the August meeting when we meet again. We can make sure we have the proper amount of time to discuss fully the issue, and so you could potentially table this to the next meeting, which would be August. Postpone, sorry.
We would need a motion to table it at this point. Adam Nowalski.
So I'm assuming you had a second to Craig's motion before, so that motion was completed? Okay. So I'll go ahead and make the motion to postpone until the summer meeting initiation of an amendment.
What we're going to do is make a motion to postpone both, because there's two motions on the table right now. We can table both of them right now. And really, this is a big issue, and we need to devote time to it, because this is back of the envelope at this point. And so, who? A second. Yep. Russell. Any discussion? John McMurray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know why we'd even consider this in August. I mean, for God's sake, let's get through this addendum first. Let's put these options that we developed today out to the public and see what their reaction is. I mean, we're talking about a complete look at the goals and objectives, Mike, and you're basing it on assumptions about productivity that they aren't supported by the science. I mean, just from my perspective, looking at the young of the year indices, there's plenty of fish coming up that could jumpstart that SSB, jumpstart the rebuilding to the SSB target, as long as we keep them alive to get there. So I think we're getting way ahead of ourselves by starting this now, and I'm perfectly willing to consider it after we're done with the addendum, but this is premature. Thanks.
All right. We have a motion to table, postpone till next meeting, 2 motions. Everyone clear on what we're going to vote for? All right. All affirmative, raise your hand. Thank you. Opposed? No. No. Abstention? Motion passes 15-1. All right. The last agenda item is we need to consider the letter that has been crafted in response to a request to lift the ban on recreational fishing in the federal Block Island Transit Zone. In your materials, you've seen the letter, which essentially says, no, given the stock conditions, we think it's unwise to open up part of the EEZ. Comments? Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would not support sending that letter to National Marine Fisheries Service. I spoke at length at the February meeting as to why I didn't support drafting the letter. So I'm still in a position where I would support allowing fishing in the transit zone for a couple of reasons. One is the amount of area that's going to be open there, the amount of area of the EEZ is very, very small. Having that closure also prohibits the charter boat fleet and private boats from fishing for other species in that area if they've already caught a striped bass. So if a charter boat goes out and they've got their 6 fish in the box, then they can't go into this other area to fish for scup or sea bass or summer flounder, for instance. Also, in the meeting materials, there was a couple of letters that were sent in by charter boat fishermen in New York suggesting that that area be opened for fishing, that the transit zone be open for fishing on a temporary basis. So I would like to put that on the record and recommend to National Marine Fisheries Service that they consider that as well. And then lastly, at our February meeting, I asked what the impact was on recreational fishing effort when the EEZ was closed. So I'd like to bring that question back up again and ask our technical people and staff what the impact was when the EEZ was closed to striped bass fishing.
Thanks, Emerson. So the question was, with the closure of the EEZ in 1990, if we could figure out what those effects were on harvest effort. I think those 2 pieces. And so we looked back at it, and essentially there's a lot of things going on at that time. Regulations were relaxing throughout the 1990s, and effort was increasing during that time, and it's hard to see how that closure actually affected effort and harvest in the EEZ or across the coast in general. I hope that answers the question, but the point is that there was a lot of things changing in the fishery and the management of the fishery, and so it's hard to pinpoint the exact effects of the EEZ closure during that time.
Go ahead, Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Max, for that response. And also, thank you, Max, for sending me some information last week relative to that. And looking at that information that you sent, Yes, I agree. There's no clear trend, but the one thing that I do see is that the number of, or the proportion of trips, striped bass directed trips in the EEZ, really did not decline after that ban was put into place. And in fact, they continue through 2017 to be striped bass directed trips conducted in the EEZ, in the recreational fishery. So I don't see where opening up this little sliver of the EEZ is going to make any difference. Recreational harvest is going to be constrained by what we put in place in terms of size and bag and season. Thank you.
Thank you. Jay McNamee and Tom Foti.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just make a quick comment in support of the letter. But one thing, and it's with due respect to Commissioner Hasbrook, we see the potential for this opening to complicate the enforcement issues in that area. It has to do with the location of some of the proposed line or the existing lines and where the actual, activity goes on in this area. They're not in the same spot. So this would actually complicate enforcement of rules in that area further. And so for that reason, along with, the findings from the stock assessment, we are in support of submitting the letter that we crafted.
Tom Foti.
It was the only time that Larry Sims, Jerry Schill, and I, all three of us were on a congressional testimony saying that the EEZ should be shut and kept shut. And that was 1995. And you all know Jerry and you knew Larry, who passed away. But we couldn't agree on a lot of things, but we agreed on that. It has basically been a sanctuary out there. If the EEZ, once we start opening it, if we start doing that, the catch of striped bass will go up dramatically because we know there's fish in the EEZ, so the guys will be targeted. And nobody fishing in the EEZ, if they're targeting striped bass, they're doing it illegally and they should be caught. I mean, one of the reasons I think Virginia Trophy Tag Program started going down was because NIMS started really enforcing the closure of the EEZ, so the numbers fell right away around the bridge opening because the guys were fishing in the EEZ. And that's happened in areas in New Jersey when they did the same. So I support the letter because I can't support opening up the EEZ for anything. At the same time, we're talking maybe of doing a 25 or 17% reduction on the whole recreational sector, and now we're opening up another fishery. We look like kind of hypocritical.
Tom, would you like to make a motion to forward the letter to NOAA Fisheries?
I'll make that motion.
Second. Justin Davis. Discussion? Any caucus needed? Brief caucus.
The only states that would really benefit if we ever opened the EEZ was North Carolina. The whole commercial fishery was the EEZ, and they haven't been able to have any commercial fishery at all.
So the motion on the table is to forward the Block Island Transit Zone letter to NOAA Fisheries. All affirmative, raise your hand.
He did retire.
Okay. Opposed?
If they do, I will send a letter. Let me know, please. I know. 86.
Null.
87, yeah.
Abstain. Motion carries 13-1, 2 abstentions. Are we done? Is there any other business to come before this board? Seeing none, we are adjourned. Oh, hold it. Wait.
Sorry. I do want to just remind the board that we'll be developing a plan development team for the addendum that just passed today, the initiation of the addendum, I should say. So look for an email from me looking for nominations. It'll include a couple sentences of what types of skill sets and knowledge of the fishery and data those personnel should have. Thank you.